acknowledgement to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tla'amin Nation, as well as all Coast Salish First Nations on whose traditional territories we have the honor to live, including my home on Ho'ete, also known as Laskidi Island. We have an agenda before us. Would someone like to make any changes or move to adopt? Motion by Director Brander,
Uh,
seconder.
no,
Oh,
I'd like to make a
oh, okay, you'd like to make an amendment. Okay.
change. Yeah.
Okay, Director Brander, you have the floor. And then I see Director McCormick.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering if we could change the order of the items so that item 8.5 follows item 8.7.
Okay, so that's a proposal 8.5 following
I'll
8.7.
second that.
Okay, seconded by Director McCormick. And was there anything well, maybe we'll just deal with one. Oh, geez, is there any other changes proposed? Director McCormick, did you have something?
No, it was the same thing. Because 8.7 talks about unallocated community works funds and 8.5 is an allocation. So it makes sense that the policy should come first.
Yeah, that's fine. So we have a mover and seconder. So are there any other, um, let me pin the room so I can see any other changes? No. So that's any discussion on the motion to adopt the approval of the agenda as amended? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? None opposed. That carries as amended. Okay, we have minutes. We haven't met since June. It's amazing. 2 months, no finance committee meeting, but I think we're going to start making up for that ground today. Is there any changes or errors in those minutes? And if there are none, would someone like to make a motion to adopt them? Director Elliott, Director Lennox, is there any discussion on that? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed, carries. Okay, we have no delegations or inquiries, no unfinished business. So right down to reports, 8.1 financial planning process. And I guess we'll start off maybe if there's any questions and maybe see if Ms. Greenan has any comments. But first, any questions from around the table for Ms. Greenan? Director Gisborne?
Uh, Sorry. Yes, I read the report. I see there's two options. One is to start the process to have the first financial plan draft in January, then February, and then March for final adoption. And then the other option is to have the first draft in December with scheduled adoption for February. And I'm just wondering, could there be a third option, which is similar to last year, where we do our first draft in December with scheduled final adoption in March, which I think is how 2025's worked out. Would that be something that could work?
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair, yes, the board can choose that option.
Okay.
Or make that an option.
Okay, are there any other questions? And so I have a question for Ms. Greenan, if I might, which is if we did go with an option that started in January, option one, which does run the risk of having a bit of a time pressure, but I also understand some of the other aspects. In the December meeting, are there any plans, or should the board make any motions that would help bring forward any items related to the budget, because that might provide an opportunity to address some major changes, increases, or new projects and so on that might help get the draft in January further along.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Through the chair, yes, the more information we have, the better to make the first draft. So yes, if there's any anything that you want included in the financial plan, it would be best to have that in December.
Okay. So I'll so Director Elliott, if you have questions, go ahead.
Thank you. So if there's conversations about things like the rec center that might bring up new information that need to be included in the financial plan, that having that first draft, because things might change in December, might be the better way to go. That's my question as far as you, Ms. Greenan, might be concerned.
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair. Well, any information that we get in December or January, February, or March, we will incorporate that into the subsequent drafts. So, whether it's in a budget presentation or if it comes to us in another format, it still will be incorporated into the budget presentations.
Okay, so basically neutral on that.
Yes, it doesn't really, it doesn't really make a big difference to the finance staff if the information comes through a formal budget presentation or if it comes in a different format. Like we'll get delegations will present their budget information to us, and then we'll just incorporate that into the subsequent draft.
So to add maybe part of an answer on my part, I think what I'm hearing, and Ms. Green can correct me if I'm wrong, if we did have a start in January for the first draft, we, the staff could bring forward things for December, but we could also put forward motions either today, notice of motion maybe, or in October to ask for certain topics, bigger ticket items that we're aware of that we want to discuss in December or maybe November to actually get some of those things done. And if we make decisions on those items, then they would be rolled into the draft. So that's how I maybe see the process. Maybe I'll confirm, is that correct, Ms. Greenan, if that was the case?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, of course, any board decisions would go into the first draft. All I'm recommending is in option 1 is that the first formal draft, so the formal actual budget draft with everything incorporated, wouldn't be until January, but there'll always be decisions that will be incorporated into that formal draft. And as Director Fall said, they could come in September, October, anytime.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions before we seek a motion? Is there anything else, Ms. Greenan, that we should know about before we deliberate?
No, nothing that isn't in the report. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks. So it's open to the committee. What's your will? Director Gisborne and then Director Elliott.
I would like to move the motion that's in the package with the addition of December before January. So it would read with draft plans scheduled for December, January, February, and March.
Okay, is there a seconder for that motion, Director Lennox? Okay, discussion on that motion, which is starting in December and then having 4 iterations. Director Gisborne and then Director Elliott, since you made the motion.
I'll be relatively brief. So last year we started in December, and one of the nice things about starting in December is it kind of gives us as a board, a bit of a heads up of kind of where we're going. It is a bit of a challenge for our finance department because, of course, it still hasn't been year end. So some of the information that we get in that draft 1 hasn't solidified. So that's why sometimes when we get into January, February, the numbers change because, well, the year hasn't actually finished yet. But I do believe that having that meeting in December can actually be a great benefit to us because there will be some extra topics that we need to discuss, for example, the recreation complex and other services and capital projects. And that also might be a good way for us to kind of temperature check where we are with the budget and then to start giving those priorities. And that gives us a bit of extra time. And I'm a big fan of you can do something quick or you can do something right. And I think if we give it the time that's due, then I think we'll come up with a good process in the end. And that's why I suggest doing the 4 months.
Okay, thanks. Director Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm kind of wondering about adding the additional 1 because there was 3 and now we're trying to do 4 in this motion. And I think that the first draft generally generates discussion and we come up with some revisions that we might like to see prior to draft 2. And that generates work for staff to do to the next draft. And right before Christmas is not the best time to expect something in January. So my question, I guess, is whether we should pick December or January and not have both as targets for a draft. And I think it might be better to do December, February, March rather than December, January, because we as directors tend to, when we see the first draft, we have a lot of things we want to consider as far as changes or something before the next draft or to be considered. And that takes time and effort. And those decisions, if we start in December, would be, generating work right at the Christmas holiday rather than, and it may I don't know if my concern is valid or not, but that's what I was thinking.
Ms. Greenan, maybe you have thoughts on that, whether having, if there's a December draft, whether it would make sense to then not have a January draft, or whether that causes a lot of onus on staff.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for bringing that up, Director Elliott. That it does make it tight between the December 9th draft and then, because we don't get really the decisions until the December board meeting, and then to try and turn it around because we do have the office closure in there as well. So so yeah, if we could do the second draft, as Director Elliott mentioned, in February, that would make it easier to turn the second draft around.
So I would move that amendment then.
Okay, so
I'll
that's
second that.
okay. Moved and seconded to remove January from the motion. Is that the motion?
No.
Yes,
Oh,
please.
the mover's walking away.
Yeah.
I'm changing my short chair for one.
Okay, Chair.
Oh, okay. So we have okay. So we can continue with discussion. The mover can speak if she wants, but Director McCormick, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I just wondered, is that motion still on the table?
Yeah. So well, this is an amendment to the motion. So the main motion
take out
is
December and put in January.
correct.
Okay.
Yes, no, to take out January from the motion. So the amendment was, the motion is December, January, February, March. The amendment is to remove January, so that it would remain, if it passed, it would be December, February, and March.
Oh, okay. Sorry, then I misunderstood. So I'm not seconding that motion. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought it was to remove December because I'd like it to start in January. So I don't support that amendment.
Okay, Director Brender, is that
Yeah,
the
I'll
second?
Sure.
Okay, so second. So we have an amendment on the table. So the discussion right now, if the committee wants, is on the amendment. Director Gisborne.
Yes, I guess it's kind of a bit of a question to our manager of financial services. So if this amendment passes and we remove January so that the motion is December, February, and March, could we still, as a finance committee, review the draft one from December at the January committee in case we have like some extra topics, but it wouldn't then put the impetus on staff to come up with like another draft document? That would still work for us, right?
Ms. Greenan, that would be feasible, I suppose?
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yes, that would be feasible. We could actually make it formal and even put in there, put in the schedule that we review draft one again in January.
Okay. Yeah, that makes me happy.
Okay, Director McCormick.
Thank you, Chair. It seems like more work for staff to have to come up with a draft one of the budget in December when the time frame is very tight and the office is closed, etc. To me, starting in January makes perfect sense. We're coming in to a new year refreshed and ready to go. And I think that's the right time when staff are there and have the numbers at their fingertips to provide us with the information that we want. It won't be so preliminary as it would be in December, but I think that we could have an item on the December Finance Committee agenda, which simply says, input into budget discussion, and so we could do that informally if we so chose. But I don't support the amendment because I think we should start in January, not in December.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other discussion on the amendment, Director Elliott?
Okay. So generally speaking, seeing the draft one and having public see draft one ahead and then having available in January for discussion makes tons of sense to me. And so we could discuss, make recommendations in December, but I think the more valuable discussion without a new draft will be in January, because all of us will have been able to hear from our public and our folks out there, any comments they have. We will have heard from various avenues, ideas for what they think might want to be changed. And so that would be ideally the time to discuss. Draft one would be in January, but the conversation in January is a little bit difficult if we haven't seen it right until January. So I liked the proposal that Ms. Greenan said that we could put it on the agenda for discussion in January, but it rolls out in December so that we've all been able to see it for a lengthy time before we dive into discussing it.
Corporate officer and then Director Lennox.
Sorry,
Yeah.
was that proposal on the table?
I was speaking to the amendment and why I liked it.
Okay, so is the amendment that we would have it as an FYI in December and consider it for business in, okay. I might not.
Okay, so we're clear. Director Lennox, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. And I think each time I can speak personally approaching budget time, I need as much time as possible. And we had, we got some big ticket items to talk about, some things that take time to take away. So I think it strikes a good balance of putting it in front of us, getting it, it's our business of the day, but giving us that time in January, like you said, to formulate a lot of the questions and maybe have some answered and etc. So I'm in support.
Okay, thank you. Director Gisborne and Director McCormick.
And I'll be very quick. The amendment is to change the main motion by striking out January. The main motion is the regional district financial planning process with draft plans scheduled for December, crossing out January, February, and March. So what that would mean is 3 draft financial plans. We'd get the first one in December. We would also get another one in February and one in March. I do believe this amendment is good because we don't need another draft in January, unless, of course, there's something that we really want and we come up with that in December. But what we could even do in December is we get the draft financial plan in December, we have a review of it, and if we decide, we could say, hey, let's forward draft 1 to the January meeting and have another look at it. But what this motion would, if this amendment passes, would be, hey, staff are going to provide us with 3 draft financial plans, 1 in December, 1 in February, and 1 in March. And then hopefully we've got everything sorted out by then. And I think it gives us extra time. And I'm a big fan of getting it before the holidays, just because of feedback from the public, and it gives us a lot of time to really digest all the nitty gritty that comes with these financial plans and how that impacts taxation. So I just wanted to point that out about main motion would actually say is that we're going to ask for 3 financial plan drafts. And we could have an extra discussion in January, which I think we'll leave that up to the committee.
Okay, thank you for that. Director McCormick.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted clarification on something that the corporate officer said. I believe you said it would be an FYI item in December, or did I get that wrong?
Corporate officer.
Sorry, I was just trying to get some clarification on the plan. Director Gisborne just explained that it was December for consideration, February and March, with the amendment currently on the table.
So the FYI item was referring to the January meeting?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the board could, the committee, if we received the first draft in December, we could refer it to the January Finance Committee meeting. So I don't think we need to do anything today on that if we went forward with this option. We could choose to do that or not at the time. Okay, is there any further discussion on the amendment? So the amendment right now is to strike out January from the motion. Okay, seeing no other discussion, all in favor of the amendment? All opposed to the amendment? None opposed. That carries. So now we're on the main motion, which is as in the agenda, except instead of January, the wording is December. Is there any further discussion on that? I have one question for our manager of financial services, Ms. Greenan. So I completely, I'm concerned about the work that staff might have to do before Christmas, before the holidays. On the other hand, most of the work would have to be done before the holidays anyways to get it for the January meeting. So with having a first draft in December and not an updated one in January, is that fit with the workload that you're able to do, or is that going to be onerous in any way?
Thank you, Chair. No, that fits within our work plans. We can make that work. I always find, the first draft is the most difficult, but it's kind of nice to get it out of the way before, before the holidays. So, that will work into our work plans.
Okay, thank you. In that case, I'm in favor, and I'll just add one other item. I fully anticipate draft one will be drafty. One of the reasons, we often talk about surpluses, but surpluses clearly are completely out of whack in before the year end because the year's not ended yet. So, we don't usually see those till later. And I think it still stands that if there are larger items that this committee would like to discuss in more details, you can still bring those forward. So I think if we know that the draft will have some holes in it and we'll say it's not complete, and I think I fully accept that. I think that's totally fine. But if there's items that like the recreation center has been mentioned as an example, that if those are really big items that should be discussed earlier, then notices of motions or other ways to move things onto the table should be considered either, well, today, but maybe in the October meeting to kind of get them into the focus point. Okay, is there any further discussion on the main motion as amended? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? None opposed. That carries. Okay, good. That's on to the next item, which is 8.2, investment policy potential amendments. And I guess we'll do the same thing again. Maybe first see if there's any questions for our financial staff. And seeing none, maybe I'll ask Ms. Greenan, is there anything we should know about this? I think we've all read it, but is there any other details you'd like to let us know about?
Thank you, Chair. I think in that regional district's case, we don't have a lot of, we don't have long-term financial plans, where we can decide, where we can earmark funds that we can invest long-term. And so that's my concern with incorporating the ESG investments is that they do carry risk. And especially if we're just going to do them for short terms, sometimes you can balance out the risk if you can leave them in longer. But because we don't have definite plans of when we'll use the reserve funds, there is that risk. And that's why I'm recommending against incorporating ESG investments into our investment policy.
Right, Director Lennox.
Thanks, Chair. Ms. Green, thanks, Ms. Green. And I'm just trying to understand with ESG sort of in the news, politically and otherwise, and with different corporations and organizations trying to understand it and then create policy. I understand your recommendation. My question is, what are other jurisdictions financially, like I guess other RDs like us, how are they tackling their investment? Is there guidance from the investment community? I would think you could just flush that out a bit.
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so when I wrote my report, I did research what other communities are doing. I researched what they're doing in Thompson-Nicola, Capital Regional District, and none of them have really incorporated ESG investments because they don't, because they do carry that risk. And if they do have ESG investments, they are generally targeted for the longer term where they have money that they've earmarked that they can invest for a longer term. But most of them have steered away from ESG investments.
Thank you.
Yeah, Director Southcott.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Reading this report, I recall that sometime within the past few years, I attended a workshop or a session at UBCM that dealt exactly with this question of ESG and the desire usually for progressives like local government people to direct investment that way. The conclusion, as I remember, was that the only municipalities that really have the ability to do that are ones with really big bank accounts like Burnaby, who has income from a big casino, for example. And that local governments, generally speaking, found other ways to address those objectives. So I didn't exactly see that in your report, Ms. Greenan, but and it took a little bit of thinking to bring that back in my memory, but I am confident that like with reference to considerations for procurement and our connection to social procurement over many years, that the ESG considerations are actually addressed through our staff's practices. So and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So is there any further discussion? Maybe we should, Director Elliott and then Director Lennox.
So there are banks and financial institutional investment places that offer mutual funds in ESG. And yes, there is risk affiliated, but the risk is not the same as a high risk portfolio risk. It's just like barely percentage points above or beyond what some of the other portfolios have. And they sometimes shift towards, local credit unions and things that are really not that risky to begin with, but may not pay off in the short term, as you say. The benefits of investing in ESG, though, is to pool our financial investment to things where you get a value added for your local economies and for the things that matter that we're trying to make a difference on a governance front. And so if we are collectively pooling our investments toward things that are making a difference in things we are trying to make a difference in governance, such as environmental outcomes and so forth, we're then having outcomes that we didn't have to pay directly for. And we're realizing them as communities across the board. And so I don't know how you balance that slight increase in risk with the overall approach around meeting better social goals, because all of those social things, as we are seeing in our streets right now, are costing all governments money. And so if all governments get a little more conscious on how they invest their funding, we may see a difference from that upside. The investment portfolio can help us achieve goals that we don't have to directly have a program for.
Thank you for that. Before I hand it to Director Lennox, we're getting a little bit away from questions about clarifying and a bit into debate.
Okay, so my question is the actual difference in risk. Is there a quantifier for that?
Okay, Ms. Greenan, there's a question.
Thank you, Chair, through the chair. So yes, the risk with the ESG investments is that we might not, they're not like GICs or term deposits where you have your principal protected. So you might have to, we could put them in ESG mutual funds. And again, those do carry some risk of principal. So it would basically be, what we would need to do is we would need to change our policy away from principal protection to, having our having our focus be on, environmental social governance. So it would be a shift in how we want to, in our priority. So if we're prioritizing those investments and then steering away from, there might be a risk to principal. Because they aren't, like, for example, I can't just go to the Bank of Montreal right now. If I want to do like a short-term investment, we can just go to the Bank of Montreal and ask them for a guaranteed interest certificate, and they'll guarantee what rate of interest we'll get, and the principal is pretty much protected. But if we wanted to do environmental social, we would have to go to Bank of Montreal investments side of things, and then they would put us into different ESG focus programs. Or I would go to the Municipal Finance Authority, and they have ESG focus programs, but lots of them have a longer term time horizon. So your principal might not be guaranteed in the short term.
So the quantifier I'm looking for is like 0% risk to, and then the risk changes depending on the length of time that you're doing is kind of what you're saying, and whether they're even available over the short term.
Yes, so we'd have to look at different types of vehicles for those. And so, and often there is some risk, but if you could have them in for a longer time horizon, then you might be able to withdraw them when they're not at their lowest point. Whereas if you have them in the short term and you need to withdraw them, you might be withdrawing them when they're not doing so well. So you risk losing some of your principal.
Thank you. Director Lennox was next, and then hopefully we can get a motion on the table. Go ahead, Director Lennox.
Thanks, Chair. I was actually going to make the motion for option one as recommended.
Very good. Thank you for putting a motion on the table, Director Gisborne. As discussion, Director Lennox, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate this discussion. But for me, the point where we are regionally on the board financially, we've had good financial management, solid financial management. I want to protect the principle. I agree with those the other goals, and that it would take a shift in the mandate for, our planning. And if you pay attention, there's that market is not completely solid and is volatile, and there are a lot of influences on it. So I would like to support option one. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other discussion, Director Southcott, and then I'll add myself.
Thank you, Chair. To be consistent with being backwards in process here. What I said before was based on assumptions, but it truly is an ongoing thing in my mind. And though I saw our manager of finance nodding her head, that was essentially an argument for option one, which I do support. But it was my assumption justified? Like, am I right in making that assumption that our organization is considering many or any other ways available to consider the objectives of ESG and investments, but in our other practices?
Ms. Greenan?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Through the chair. Yes, in our procurement policy, we do try to incorporate community benefits when we do our tenders and our requests for proposals. So we do try to address our social governance. We do try to address those goals that way, especially through our procurement. That's the biggest bang that we get for our money. We just don't do it through our investments because we don't have a large investment portfolio. And but yes, we do try to address it in our strategic plan. We have social governance goals environmental governance goals in our strategic plan. So there are lots of ways that we are addressing it through our climate change initiatives, through our planning, in our OCPs, it's addressed. So yes, we do try to address it different ways, just not with our direct investing.
Thank you.
And I'll add my comments. I support and I see Director Brander. I support ESG and sympathize with comments by Director Elliott, but I also support the recommendation, and I'll give my rationale. So on page 5 of the staff report shows where our actual money is. And so when you think of ESG as we've discussed, ESG is primarily about companies. It's about investing in stocks, mutual funds, however you want to do it. And of course, we would never invest in individual stocks, way too volatile, but mutual funds and other investment vehicles. And, when you look at this, it's all very safe, capital preserving funding. Our investment strategy is about hedging against inflation primarily. So we're trying to stop, the money we're holding from taxpayers from eroding over time. If we could have some ESG in there, that would be great. But I think there's two reasons why I support the recommendation. One is we really don't have anything that would change, that would even be affected. Money market and chartered banks. The one thing that we do have that I would say is along the lines, it's not officially ESG as defined for investments, but is meeting the objectives is investments in credit union. I'm a very strong credit union supporter, and I think the more we can shift money into credit unions, because credit unions do follow those in their work, so they may, be helping advance some of those those objectives while maintaining our liquidity and our stability. And the second reason is really our current economic situation. I mean, the U.S. unfortunately is creating a multifaceted crisis that is going to require a dramatic shift in our Canadian economy and is also requiring us to be extra prudent. And I think unfortunately now is not the time to add increasing risks. We need to have decreasing risks. So I think our investments need to be able to be cautious with that. I say that because I think this issue shouldn't be dropped entirely off the table. I think it would be nice if it could be revisited by a future board, maybe in 5 years or something like that. And maybe at that time we could identify a portion of funds, some number, some percentage that could have slightly higher risk, as Director Elliott has pointed out, that could take on a bit higher risk, given that maintaining an overall relatively low risk for the total pot of funding that we're holding on to, I think could be considered. But I think that should come at a time when the global outlook is a lot more stable than it is now, and when maybe we have a bit more in the bank. But 26 million sounds like a lot. I think that's what we have, but it's not that much, and it's all in different pots because we have to maintain that. I think also maybe we need to be clear on the stability. We need to maintain that stability for each service that has funds. It's not enough to be stable over the amount of total if one service really needs its $100,000 because it's depending on it. So I'll support the recommendation, and I believe Director Brander.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment that while I agree with the concepts of ESG investments, and I think a lot of the people around the table here do as well, we're not spending our money. So even though we may do it on an individual basis, when we're looking at the public's money, I think we have to be very careful with it. And the concept of losing any of the principal kind of scares me off of the concept. So I'll be in support of the recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further discussion on this item? Seeing none, we've had a good discussion. Now, Director Elliott.
So I can read the room. I think we've come to kind of a conclusion around here that we are supporting option one. My comment is that a policy could include a very small portion initially. It could be restricted to just mutual funds of a longer term nature that eliminates or really mitigates that risk. And it's still, half a step in the right direction. And so it's not an all or nothing decision that we're contemplating around policy. And I would encourage us to revisit regularly. And, investment portfolios right now may be including investments in some areas that we maybe should be withdrawing from, like American mortgages and so forth. But I don't know that for sure because they're kind of all wrapped into the way things are going. But I understand that we're going to call the vote, and I'll be supportive of the motion. I am wanting to make the point to the entire board that this wasn't necessarily a decision of an all or nothing thing. So.
Yeah, quite right. I agree. Okay, so seeing no further hands, I will then call the question. So all those in favor? Opposed? Not opposed. Sensing some reluctance there, but that's okay. Motion carried. So we're on to item 8.3, which is the application for a permissive tax exemption from the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 232 on Texada Island. Director McCormick?
Chair, I move the recommendation.
Is there a seconder for that? Director Lennox? Let's hand first. So, okay, discussion on that item. Director McCormick?
Just to say briefly that the Legion donates its space to many, many community groups. There are meetings held there, games nights held there, social sewing events. There's, so many different community events that go on there. And they do that very generously in donating their space. So I'm really pleased to see a recommendation to grant the permissive tax exemption for next year. And I want to thank staff for that. So thank you.
Is there any Director Gisborne and Director Elliott? Go ahead, Director Gisborne.
Yeah. Sorry. I'll probably end up voting in favor of this request for permissive tax exemption. However, my political stance on permissive tax exemptions is fairly consistent. Regional districts with our siloed services means that when you give a permissive tax exemption, the remaining participants of the service have to make up the difference. So if it comes to, say, regional parks, it's the whole region that has to make up the difference. If it's, was it Texada Recreation, then it's just Texada that have to make up the difference. And that's where we've had some challenges out in Area B, where, for example, the Myrtle Point Golf Course applying for a tax exemption would strain the rest of the Malaspina Volunteer Fire Department service. And therefore, when we gave that tax exemption, they still had to pay for their portion of the fire department service. And that's where there's a big difference between municipalities and regional districts, where if it's a municipality giving a tax exemption, the whole municipality makes up the difference. Whereas at a regional district, it's the service area participants that got to make up the difference. And I think in Texada's case, I'm fine with it because I don't think the Royal Canadian Legion on Texada is a member of like a really small service area. For example, like imagine a tax exemption up in London and the sewer and water system would be a huge burden on the rest of the participants. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention, and that's why I usually vote against permissive tax exemptions, just because of that structure. But in this case, I'll probably end up being in favor with everyone else. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Director Gisborne. Director Elliott, and then I'll add myself. Go ahead, Director Elliott.
Thank you. So my question is how a permissive tax exemption breaks down in the regional district. Director Gisborne's talking about it impacting only those from a particular service area. But I know in the city, when we grant a permissive tax exemption, the city taxpayers then pick up the tab for the school district, the regional district, and all of the other things that are attached to a tax bill that are over and above just our service area. And so if I could get an explanation about whether this permissive tax exemption applies to all of the various services and things on a tax bill, or just the portion that is for the area service area.
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair, through the chair. Yes, so when we give a permissive tax exemption, it exempts the property from all of the taxes. It would exempt the property from the school district tax, from the police tax, from the BC assessment tax. So all of those then are absorbed by, so for example, if it exempts the school district tax, so now the taxpayers would, the other taxpayers that pay to the school district would have to absorb that little bit. And so my chart on page 7 shows like how much of the other taxing authorities are impacted by the tax exemption. For example, the for the QRD and QRHD taxes that we collect, so $167.33 of that would have to be absorbed by the other taxpayers that pay into the city services, for example. And the other taxing authorities, $397.78 of like the school district, BC assessment, et cetera, within the city of Paul River, that would be collected for within the city of Paul River, would have to be collected from other taxpayers. So it's sort of, yes, it does exempt the group from all of its taxes, and those get absorbed by other taxpayers.
Clarifying question?
Yes.
Follow-up? When you say exempted by other taxpayers, do you mean that area D taxpayers have to pick up the bill for all of that other stuff, or that it's spread across all areas equally within the Cathett Regional District?
I think it's the other. Ms. Greenan, go ahead. You can explain it better than me.
Okay. I don't know if I can, but yes, it is spread through all the other taxpayers. That's true for the regional services, for example. So if it was a regional service that they would generally be paying into, like general administration, then that would be then split equally amongst the City of Paul River, SNGD, ABC, and D and E. But one of the taxes that they're exempted from is Texada Recreation. So that would only be then, now the taxpayers in Area D would pay that portion. So the breakdown on page 7 just shows how much is dispersed to the other areas. So it's a little bit different with regional district taxes because we have those silos. And so like Texada Airport, those taxes would just be Area D. But the regional services, those would be spread. The taxes that they're not paying would be spread amongst all of the areas.
And maybe if I might, Ms. Green, and I'll do a follow-up question to help clarify or and answer first and see if I'm correct. If you look, Director Elliott, at the tax notice, which is on page 52 of our whole package, but it's after the staff report, it shows all the different line items for the taxes. So, for example, my understanding of permissive tax exemptions is it's effectively equivalent to setting the assessed value to 0 for the property. So it's as if we're asking BC Assessment, call whatever it's worth, we're just going to call it 0. And that way, whoever's a taxing authority treats it as if it's 0, so there is no taxes. And so what happens to the net amount? Well, if the school tax, the amount is $276. Well, actually, if you add up, it's the item 8. The part that is covered is the one with the class 8. So $545.28 last year. So what that would mean is that would be $545 that the school district does not get, and hence that has to be made up by distributing that $545 over the whole area the school district taxes. Likewise, for the improvement district has a $317 that is covered for the Van Anda Improvement District. If they're not getting that, then over the improvement district, they would have to make up that $317 by increasing the taxes by the proportional amount to all of those taxpayers. So it's in those layers. So it's essentially the effect of setting the assessed value effectively to 0. Is that correct way to characterize it, Ms. Greenan?
Yes, that is correct.
One last question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Is this the only tax exemption, permissive tax exemption being considered for our region? Because when I've seen them before, they come lumped together and we get to see the entire big picture of, or is there other ones that may come at a different time?
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. Because regional districts have such a narrow scope on what we can exempt from taxes, the only two that really qualify in our region are this one and the golf course. I can't think of any other ones because and how they qualify is that they provide public recreation. So if you look at just going to find the legislation here. Oh, here it is. Sorry, I didn't put all of the legislation in there. But there are very few properties that actually qualify for a permissive tax exemption. So the two that did were the Myrtle Point Golf Course, because they're nonprofit, and the Royal Canadian Legion. So those are generally the only two requests we've ever received. And so this is the only one that we received this year.
And to help clarify, Director Elliott, that on that tax notice again that I referred to, 2025, there's that property class. So that it's only the 08, class 8 that would be covered by the legislation. They don't, and as Ms. Greenan has put in the report, the 01 and 06, the classes 1 and 6 don't get exempted. It's all the 8. So if you add up the numbers in the report come from all the class 8 lines. So the school is 545, the provincial rural tax is 199.68, and so on. So that's the class 8. So that's only those properties in our area that would even be eligible under that portion of the legislation. Okay, so I see Director Gisborne, but I was on the list next. I'll speak. I support the request, the motion on the table, but with some words of caution and in consistent with some made by Director Gisborne on the need to consider property tax exemption requests very carefully. The financial impact section of the report states, and we've been discussing this, the staff report says if the exemption is approved, taxes would shift from the Legion to other taxpayers in the region. And as we've discussed a moment ago, that gets spread out among all the different taxing authorities. However, in this case, the primary beneficiaries of the tax exemption would be the residents of Texada. They're the ones those residents are the ones primarily using the Legion. As a comparison, the cost to operate the Lesquiti Community Hall, owned by the Community Association, are entirely paid by Lesquiti residents. The Texada Legion has on occasion applied for grants and aid covered by Area D grant and aid funds, which would be paid from Texada residents. The staff report clarifies that permissive tax exemptions exempt applicants from property taxes to all other taxing authorities as well. So they're, including and in particular, I should say, the school district and the Venanda Improvement District. So this is in a sense, I find it a bit of a non-transparent shifting of tax burden onto all other services to which property tax contributions are made. And is one reason why I think we should be cautious with permissive tax exemptions. For example, the reduction in the contribution to the school district and the Venanda Improvement District will cause those two jurisdictions to effectively have to increase their taxes to make it up. And that would appear to taxpayers like it's the school district and the improvement district that are raising taxes due to a reduction in the applicable assessed property values. But it would have been a direct result of our decision, not their decisions. Their budgets haven't changed. They've done nothing. So in effect, it would be equivalent to us raising taxes to provide the benefit through grants and aid, except we're not the ones being identified on the tax notice. That said, I can support this request in this case for two reasons. One is, as the staff report shows on page 7, and Ms. Greenan has pointed us to, the majority of the impact of this financial shifting per taxpayer is to other Texada residents. So that is how this ripples through. So in this case, it ripples through and it primarily shifts it to other people on Texada. So Texada residents end up covering it, and that's fair and equitable, and I can support that. We don't need to split hairs, and in particular because the regional services, Texada has a lot of regional services in which Texada is the only participant. So that's where a lot of the shifting happens. So it's just shifting from one place to the other. And secondarily, this tax, and this is a quote from the staff report, this tax exemption has a small financial burden on all taxpayers in the QRD. So it's minor. It helps the Texada Legion, and it's most of it's covered by Texada residents and some covered by other residents of the region. I think it's totally justifiable, and I support it. But I just wanted to raise those cautions because if we are considering these, we need to keep these thoughts in mind. Director Gisborne, I believe you had your hand up. Oh, and then Director McCormick. Oh, very good. Director McCormick?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you did? Okay, Director Gisborne, then Director McCormick.
I just wanted to, I think Director Fall actually kind of beat me to the punch on a lot of these points. When I'm taking a look at page 7 of 23, it shows that, okay, so the Legion's tax exemption would save them about $1,757. And what that means is the rest of Area D, or Texada, would have to come up with $639 to kind of cover that amount. But the City of Powell River residents would also have to come up with $565. Area A would have to come up with $281. Area B would be $99. And this is kind of at the heart of the challenge of permissive tax exemptions is it kind of breaks up. And I think the better way to do this is when it comes to the decision of the board, we then ask ourselves, okay, which portion of the region does this benefit? And therefore, who should pay for it? Because that's the discussion we have when we do grant applications, is we take a look and go, okay, we have a grant request from, say, Lesquiti Island, and we might go, okay, well, come out of Area E grant and aid. And I guess my question then is to staff, when we get a permissive tax exemption, does our policy allow the board, rather than giving a tax exemption, could we give them a grant, either through general grant and aid or Area D grant and aid, based on how the board feels, and therefore to kind of increase the transparency? Or would they have to make a separate application for a grant and aid? Or because we're probably going to get more applications in the future from other organizations. So I'm curious what
Ms.
go
Greenan?
ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair, through the chair. They would have to make a separate application, and the reason for that is that under the grants and aid program, we can't cover taxes, so they can't apply for us. They can't apply to us for the $1,100 to cover their taxes. They would have to apply to us for a different purpose, for a grant and aid. They would, they probably have a project that they wanted to do that they would apply for, or they would apply for operating funds. But we couldn't specifically make it interchangeable with the permissive tax exemption because that's specifically for taxes, which is excluded from our grant and aid program.
A quick follow-up.
Go ahead.
So my follow-up question is, would it be possible, and by possible I mean legal, to amend the the permissive tax exemption policy to enable the board to give a grant and aid in replacement of a permissive tax exemption? I know we can't do it right now, but I'm just thinking about future decisions. Would that be something we could legally do and adjust our policy?
Ms. Greenan, would that be possible?
Thank you, Chair. That's the only concern I have with it is that when the group applied, then they would have to we would have to put in our policy, like give us an option. So if you don't get it for the taxes, what other project would you use it for? Then they would have to, then they'd have to meet the grant criteria and say, this is the project we want to use it for, or we want to use it for operating funds. I don't think that the board, once the board gets the request for taxes, I think that would be difficult for the board then to try to figure out what they would give it to them for.
Long story short, that's not something that we can really entertain today.
Thank you. Director McCormick.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Speaking in favor of the recommendation, I believe that the Legion is worthy of the tax exemption that we currently make available to institutions that, in the case of the Legion, donate huge amounts of time for the use of their space, indoor and outdoor, by the public. So it's, they're a very worthy organization in that sense. And if we don't provide some incentives for organizations to donate space, donate time, donate, things to the community, then, then that isn't right. I think we do need to provide incentives for that. And so I support the recommendation. I think it might be healthy to have another discussion down the road, Chair, regarding permissive tax exemptions, period. And are we satisfied with the way we do things? Do we want to change the way we do things? But that's not a conversation for today. Today is whether or not the Texada Legion is worthy of this permissive tax exemption, which Texada residents carry the burden of the cost and would gladly do so, because I know of very few people that don't use the Legion at some point for something over the course of a month. So thank you, Chair, and I support this recommendation.
Thank you. Is there any other further discussion? Director Elliott, go ahead.
Yeah, just sometimes when we are contemplating permissive tax exemptions at the city, our budget doesn't add up to all of the applications that we get, and we decide on a percentage of a permissive tax exemption that is not 100% depending on what all the applications add up to and who's qualifies according to our policy and so forth. And in the interests of equity, the city taxpayers that make up the difference between what we do in permissive tax exemptions and if they were not there at all are also being asked to help in this case. And so I guess what I'm trying to ask is if the Legion in Powell River ends up with a permissive tax exemption of, say, 75 to 80% instead of 100, and the Texada one gets a 100% permissive tax exemption, that it feels like there's an inequity going on, and yet the city taxpayers are contributing to all of it. And my question is could we contemplate in the future having some sort of a policy that reduces from 100% to some other percentage even though I know that that's not there. And I am in support of supporting all of the legions. My question is how we could create policy that would help us with more equity.
Ms. Greenan, is that something that would be even possible to consider, I guess?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we could consider that, and the board could consider that. Because when we do the bylaw, we would then specify how much of a, if it's a 100% tax exemption for class 8, or if it's a 80% or 50% exemption for class 8. So the board could consider that, and we could, that's something that the board could consider without changing the policy.
Thank you. And keeping in mind that the motion on the table is for the full tax exemption, that's what we have before us. Is there any further discussion on the motion on the table, which is as in the agenda? Seeing none, then I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. I don't see. It's carried. Okay, very good.
We even have a motion?
Oh,
I think we were on the
Officer?
special case and
Oh, did
didn't
we?
actually put a motion.
No, Director McCormick made the motion and it was
Oh, okay.
seconded by,
Okay,
I can't remember who seconded it.
I did.
Director Lennox.
Right.
sorry.
Director Lennox, I thought. Corporate Officer?
Oh, I think Director Gisborne was going to ask for a break, and I was just going to indicate that we have more detailed motions for you to consider for this next item of business.
So a break would be appropriate.
Yes,
So you want Director Gisborne?
a point of personal privilege. I'd like a 5 or 10 minute bio, whatever works for me.
Go take your personal privilege and I'll do mine. Okay, so 5 minutes. We'll try to come back. Is that enough?
5 minutes, okay.
Remuneration.
It's the
You know the drill.
This meeting is being recorded.
Recording in progress.
Okay, we're back from our short break, and we will carry on to our next item, which is 8.4 Director's Remuneration and Expense Amendment Bylaw. And the corporate officer had some info for us.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Originally, I believe the report is recommending option number 1. Just to make it clear what the motions are going to be, we've written it out so it's quite detailed. So I think it would be best if the committee determined which option they wanted to proceed with, and then we could display that corresponding motion.
Okay, that's great. So why don't we start as we did before with a round of questions and clarifying questions for Ms. Greenan, and then the opportunity for Ms. Greenan to give us other information. So there are questions on what we're doing here and what option. And okay, Ms. Greenan, maybe is there any information that you think would be useful for us before we try to come up with a consensus?
Yes, thank you, Chair, through the chair. So on all of the options, in the discussion section, there's a section that talks about, the policies that would need to be changed. So with all of the options, it's intended that we would also make the policy changes unless the board directs otherwise. But so you may notice, like in the options, we're just talking about basically the per diems, the breakfast, lunch, dinner, incidentals, and then potentially private lodging. But for all of the options, we are recommending that, for example, we have a reference to daily recompense for directors. That actually hasn't been in place since the bylaw was amended back in 2020, but it was never removed from the policy. So for example, we still would, are recommending that change be made so that it takes the directors out of receiving a daily recompense, but the volunteers would still receive a daily recompense because they don't receive, it's not rolled into their honorariums. Also, and in the reference to meal allowances, we wanted to change the policy because the policy right now, the policy includes the per diem rates for the meals, but that's also included in the director's remuneration bylaw. So we wanted to take it out of the policy and just, refer people to the bylaw rather than having to change the policy and the bylaw every time the meal rates change. And the other thing we wanted to recommend was that we insert the term reasonable when talking about, making travel plans, that people look at reasonable costs. And so that we would like that changed. We're recommending that gets changed in any option that you choose. The other thing is the 15% gratuity on meals. We're also recommending that whichever option you choose, that still be included as an allowable expense, because we have found that generally you do need to include a gratuity. So we think it's reasonable that be called an allowable expense. And also, if a mandatory gratuity is paid, that also be included as an allowable expense. And then also, if in any case, whichever option you choose, we're recommending that new language be added to allow employees, volunteers, or directors to request a travel advance if they need one. And new language to just to direct people to try to use the most cost-effective means of travel, considering time, convenience, and safety. So we wanted that language incorporated in there just because we think it's prudent to have that language included under every option. And so the motions that the detailed motions that we've made makes that more clear when you're deciding on which option to choose.
That's great. Thank you. And I really appreciated having so much information here. I mean, there was a lot of work put into this to come up with options, and there's a lot of options on the table. So rather than maybe trying to get a motion right off the bat, maybe what we could do is I could offer an opportunity to go around the table, and each director that wants to speak might give a very brief description of which option they think we should move forward with, and then we can get it's kind of like a straw poll, and then we can get an idea of what motion is most likely to be accepted rather than going through a bunch of votes and possible failures and backtracking and amendments. So does anyone like to speak to what option they would like to put forward? Director Elliott?
I think the staff have made a great job of recommending option one, and my read of the situation is it's the most appropriate for what we're trying to accomplish in our area. They're recommending rates based on the BC government except for mileage rates, and I think that's a good way to go. The mileage rates they're recommending be the CRA rates for a lot of good reasons. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Brander.
Thank you, Chair. I also support option one, and I appreciate the staff's explanations of the additional procedures, I guess, that will be utilized, no matter what option we choose.
Okay, is anyone else? Director Gisborne?
Yeah. One of the questions that came up that initiated this whole thing was in relation to the gratuity to the tips. My understanding is, including tips as part of the reimbursement is kind of being supported across the board. And I'm just kind of curious about the appetite of those around the table of keeping that in our policy or putting that in our policy to say that we will, allow for tips as part of the meal allowance. Because just speaking for myself, I don't tip. The history of tipping in North America actually has a really dark past relating to slavery and racism. I'm a big firm believer that businesses should pay their employees the appropriate amount and not rely on the customer to kind of make up that missing wage amount. The BC government eventually saw this and they ended up changing the minimum wage. So that way the minimum wage is the same whether you're serving alcohol or working in the dish pit. So I guess if the policy goes, well, I don't tip with my own money, I guess I could tip with the taxpayers' money is the way I'm reading this. That's why I do have a big issue with tipping.
Maybe I can convert that into a question for Ms. Green. And if I understand correctly, the travel expenses for directors, if we went with option one, for example, the travel expenses for directors, which are fixed rates per meal, they basically encompass tipping, whatever tipping a director would like to do. The language related to adding tipping or into the policy 4.2, that would relate to staff and volunteers who are traveling and paying for meals and then getting reimbursed for actual expenses. Is that correct? Or maybe you can clarify.
Thank you, Chair, through the chair. Yes, that's correct. Well, kind of. When staff travel or volunteers travel, they also get the same rates as directors. So they would get breakfast $25.50, and that wouldn't matter if they added a 15% tip onto that. They're only getting $25.50 for their breakfast. The tips would relate to, it's when you have a group meeting, like for example, when the board meets as a group at say they meet as a group and at the UBCM, and then that's paid for as the group. Then there's sometimes there's a mandatory tip added when you have a group meal of that sort. And so right now, that's not an allowable expense. So whoever pays for that meal doesn't get reimbursed for the tip. They only get reimbursed for the meal, not including alcohol. But so if you have a business meeting, like say you have a business meeting, a director meets with the CAO of the city and they pay for a meal and they claim that as an allowable expense, then right now, you wouldn't be able to claim the tip. And so if you decided not to claim it, not to give a tip, you would just claim the amount on your receipt. But if you decided to give a tip of say 10%, then you would just claim the 10% tip.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that explains it. The taxpayers will make up the difference.
So any other discussion around the table? Director Lennox?
Yeah, I understand this subject quite well because I do a ton of traveling, and so I appreciate the staff identifying some of those other objectives that we can clear up, and it makes it more efficient for them and us. I'm moving towards option one. The impact looks to be the most kind of acceptable. It is interesting that discussion around mileage rates. I could go on and on about what the actual effect is on people's vehicles, like mine. But I think it strikes a bit of a balance. I understand the tipping thing. For me, when you just give a nominal amount per meal, that kind of handles that question so that you can tip or not according to how much you have, say for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So I have a few other related questions, preferred supplier agreements that I don't know if any other regional districts get into. You mentioned it's very hard to not pigeonhole, but determine if somebody's been reasonable or not with their accommodation choice, because I know that can go sideways. And many jurisdictions, especially lodging, is just outrageous at certain times of year. And then there's another point that's come up for me in my other job where certain, if you go to the lower mainland to Vancouver, all your costs are somewhat exponentially higher than they are in, say, a small town somewhere else. So there's a bit of a discussion around an elevated rate for when you're at larger centers. So I know that's not part of today's discussion, but option one is where I'm leaning right now.
Thank you. Okay, I'll add, seeing neither so Director Southcott or Director McCormick, but I'll add myself. I also lean towards option one. I think it has a minimal cost of the change from what we've been doing, so it's not increasing costs in particular. It appears to reduce the admin and administration overhead, and it in particular in relation to any of the other options that peg amounts to other regional districts, because that sort of incurs future surveying and so on, whereas tying it to the BC government costs makes it a lot simpler for staff to just look up a number, and it also, in tying the mileage to the CRA amounts makes it also another lookup. So I think that is appropriate and also clear. It's clear where we're getting the numbers from. Someone could look up and say, there's the table from, BC government level 2 employees. So it's not the high end and it's not the low end, which I think is also appropriate, where, we shouldn't be up, the level, the high end of the government ones, but neither at the low end. I think it's appropriate. I also really support the idea of adding private lodging reimbursement costs, which the province does as well, because that really incentivizes savings. If you allow some reimbursement to stay at someone's house, if you're in the Lower Mainland or if you're in Victoria or wherever, and I was actually thinking in particular about how when Director McCormick used to stay at her own place, that there was actually no incentive for that. There was an incentive to just stay at the hotel. Whereas having that incentive means you can bring something to your friends when you're staying with friends and or family, and helps provide that rather than just saying let's just stay at a hotel. So I think that really incentivizes savings, because the amount is way less than a hotel anywhere in the province. So I think any time someone stays with private lodging, it's going to save the taxpayer, and we want people to be encouraged to do that. So I support option one. Now I'm looking to Director McCormick or Director Southcott if they wish to say anything, and if not, that's fine. We can wait for a motion to be put on the table. I can't see hands that are up anymore. So
Brander has his hand up.
Yeah,
oh,
Chair,
Director Brander,
option
go ahead.
one.
Okay, Director Brander's moved option one. Is there a seconder for that? Is that Director Lennox? I can see. Okay, so we have a motion on the table, and it's as put up there, the corporate officer. Is there any discussion on the motion on the table now, which is to move option one, which would include all the changes? It's not just the travel allowance amounts. It includes, if I saw the whole motion there, I believe it includes all the changes that are in red in the agenda. So if there's anything that, any other changes, that would be appropriate. So Director Elliott wants to see it. Probably a good idea.
I'll try to make it bigger.
Chair, I have a quick question on the motion.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Thanks. And as for staff, I'm not sure if there's an answer yet, but just looking at under kind of the other objectives here, the 3 new procedures, including advances, alternate travel arrangements, and then utilizing most cost effective. I guess the question is, are there any considerations or regional districts using that preferred supplier agreement for hotels and any chains? Just through my experience, there's better rates.
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, we never looked into that, so that would be something that we would have to research.
Thank you.
So I just have a question for clarity around the motion.
Okay, Director Elliott, go ahead.
Thank you. Amend Article 15 to include the 15% gratuity. So that Article 15 would be when you're doing group things, not individuals. And if you're doing a group thing at a restaurant and the mandatory is 20%, or some other number than 15, this policy would restrict the payer to only recover the 15%.
Ms. Green, is that correct?
So no, what we would like to put into item 15 would be that, so if a meal is purchased while on that regional district business, a gratuity paid would be an eligible claim up to a maximum of 15% of the subtotal of the invoice, exclusive of alcohol. If a mandatory tip is required above 15%, this will be considered as an allowable expense. So yes, if the mandatory tip was 20%, then that would be considered an allowable expense. It would just be the discretionary tip would be limited to 15%.
Okay, so I couldn't see that part in the motion, but thank you.
Director Elliott, if you look on page 23 of 27, the actual full wording, which was, summarized, says, a gratuity paid is an eligible claim up to a maximum of 15%, exclusive of alcohol. So we don't get tips on alcohol. If a mandatory tip, non-discretionary, is required above 15%, this will be considered an allowable expense. So it's the language in the red line
In the report,
amendments
yeah.
would cover what you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
Is Director Lennox?
Yeah, sorry, Chair, just because I'm thinking of things from my past here. Is there any passage here I might have missed it where there's any type of managerial or CAO approval to exceed the policy?
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. Where the only part that we have for the manager to exceed the policy would be in around the travel plans. So, for example, if when making travel plans, we would like people, we will encourage people to use the most cost-effective method. But if there's some other reason, that the travel plans have to be changed, then the CAO could approve that. For example, say that I'm trying to think of an example of when that would happen. Say that it would be the least expensive would be to fly, but there's a person that has a fear of flying, then we would need the CAO approval to say, okay, that's fine. They can drive in that case.
Okay, so that's the only discretion is in the travel plans.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Is a further discussion on the motion on the table? Director Gisborne, go ahead.
Yeah, as I understand the existing policy says gratuity paid is not an eligible claim, and this proposal is that it will change to a gratuity paid is an eligible claim up to a maximum of 15% of the subtotal of the invoice, exclusive of alcohol. If a mandatory tip, non-discretionary, is required above 50%, this will be considered an allowable expense. My understanding is that is one of the proposed changes. One of the proposed changes with option 1, I'm fine with, but I do have an issue with gratuities and how it's kind of seeped into our culture. It's not as common in Europe. It actually came over from Europe as like the aristocracy to kind of keep the serfs happy if they do an amazing job. And then it got adopted in the United States after the abolition of slavery. and well, there's a lot of bad history there, and it's kind of seeped up into Canada. And I know right now there's a lot of talk about, Canada is not the United States, but we keep adopting their culture. There was actually a number of states that actually banned and made it illegal to tip. It was eventually repealed due to prohibition, as restaurant owners weren't able to make enough money on the alcohol sales. So I do have a problem with tipping being subsidized by the taxpayers in this policy. But if it's just me, I won't be the one to be a thorn in everyone's side. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware that there is a really bad history with it, and there's a lot of folks trying to actually undo that history and undo that harm. And I also have to tip my hat to the BC government for actually making that change in terms of minimum wage. But I do have a problem with the regional district moving in this direction. I see it as very American, and I'm not American. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Director Gisborne. Is there any further discussion on this package, this motion that's got its whole package? Okay, seeing none, then I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. That carries. Okay, 8.5, we're jumping after 8.7. So 8.6 is our interim financial statements. I guess I'll, just because they're quite extensive, so maybe first I'll hand it to Ms. Greenan to see if there's anything she would think we need to know, and then I'll open it up for some questions before we basically receive them. So Ms. Greenan, is there any red hot items that we need to be aware of in these financial statements?
Thank you, Chair. No, I've made notes throughout the financial statements, but there's nothing that really is of concern. There are a couple of items where we might have to do a budget amendment, but they can be, the budget amendment can be done within the service. It would just be amending one line to a different line. So no, there's nothing that's come to my attention that I need to bring to the director's attention.
Okay, thank you. And I really appreciated all the line changes. I went through those. It helps, they're very extensive. It really helps to focus on where the big changes are. And because we're 58%, I believe it was, through, it's obviously, we can't expect things to be right on top. And so the notes point out either reasons why things are different, or, what the cause of the changes. Maybe I do have one question for you, which is there's a few points in the throughout that identify items that may need to be increased. And sometimes the amount, at first it caught me off. It looks like there's been lower spending than budgeting, but the budget's for the whole year. So that means if the spending is higher than 58% by some significant amount or systemic amount, is that correct? So some of the staff items, I think for some of the regional parks in particular is when I was noticing it. Is that correct? Is that they're above that 58%, that threshold, and we expect that they'll exceed the budget by the year end?
Yes. So for example, the staff items, like the contractors for, I'm trying to find an example, sorry.
One of the regional any of the regional parks, they all have them.
So for example, the contractors for Hayward Bay Park, these statements are to July 31st, 2025. So there won't be okay, so for example, the one on page 20 that's page, not sure what part of the agenda that is, but page 20 of the actual report for the Hayward Bay Park. For example, we have contractors' wages of $25,853.34, but there's no budget for contractors' wages. And that is because originally it started out when we did the budget that it was a staff position, but it changed to a contract position. So we don't really need a formal amendment because we can just do an internal amendment within that budget. So that's nothing to be concerned about.
Right. Thank you for that. And some of these items, of course, are information for the next round of budget. So we'll expect some of those increases to show up there, and here's some justification for some of those items. Is there any other questions around the table before we get a motion on those. I don't see anyone jumping up and down. So is there anyone who would like to make a motion then?
So moved.
Moved. Okay, so seconded by Director. I was waiting. I was going to silence, but okay. So the motion's on the table to accept for information the financial statements of to July the 31st. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? None opposed. That carries. Okay, so we're on to item 8.7, or I guess it would be 8.6 now, but 8.7 in our agenda, which is the one we've been waiting for, Fund Allocation Policy 3.12. So before we get into a motion, there is a recommendation, but the report's quite extensive. So maybe first a round of questions if people have. So Director McCormick, then Director Gisborne.
Thank you. Excuse me. This is something I've been championing for a long time. So I want to thank staff very much for this report and the recommendation for option 4 in the report, which I can live with that. So my first question is regarding the basis on which you're proposing to allocate community works funds. There were different ways when the research was done a couple of years ago regarding how other regional districts do it. You can do it by population. There can be a base amount to each electoral area, plus population or not. It can be by the number of services, or it can be equal among electoral areas. So I'm just wondering why staff chose the 75 to 25% split and based on population. So what was the basis for that recommendation coming forward?
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. The reason I chose that was that there is more pros than cons to my mind in that recommendation. And the reason is that I thought, okay, one of the things that's great about having the 25% allocated for the pooled regional or EA priorities, and then the 75% distributed on population, is that I know that the directors were interested in having the funds distributed on population. So I thought, well, that 75% of it sort of gets towards what the directors were looking for. And then the 25%, the thing that I liked about that is that it there's an annual, it gives a dedicated amount for other priorities. So but it's less than the other options. So it gives 25% could then be used. So, say the board, let's just use an example from the actual financial plan. So for example, we have plans for in 2026 that $300,000 will be used for a Lasqueti fire truck. So under the allocation by population, that would put Lasqueti into a negative balance for their community works funds. But the board could then use, instead of just borrowing the funds for a number of years, the board could decide, that's a real priority for us. Let's use our 25% towards that initiative. Or sometimes there could be another initiative that, it's hard, it might be a regional initiative that the board really wants to do. This gives a defined amount that the board could use for that rather than just looking at the whole pool. Mm-hmm. So that's, so it was because of the number of pros and cons compared to the other options that I thought option 4 made the most sense.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I have a follow-up question, and that is when the research was done previously talking to the other regional districts, some of them had a process whereby the electoral area directors were the ones who approved the final allocation, not the whole board. And so I'm just wondering, how did they do that? Because the report sort of recommends against going in that direction, but I'm just wondering, the ones who do it that way, how do they do it?
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. in many cases, I think it was sort of the way that we used to do it, where they had a a committee made up just of rural directors that would put the proposal forward. And then, but most of them, even though the rural directors are the ones that recommend the funding, the whole board still votes on it. So I don't exactly know like where there are some where only the electoral area board votes on it. I'm honestly not sure exactly what authority they're using to do that.
Okay, that's because I know you can do it. That's how planning committee does it. Only members of the planning service vote at the board regarding motions coming forward. So planning can do it. An electoral area services committee should be able to do it as well, rather than it going to the whole board.
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. We did research making Community Works into a service, but because it's not a service, whereas the planning is a service, so it's actually a service that has those the 4 electoral area directors as participants, but Community Works funds can't be a service. So that's why I don't exactly know how those other jurisdictions do it.
Thank you, Chair.
Director Gisborne, I believe you were next.
Yes. Reading the staff report, it references the December 4th, 2024 Finance Committee meeting where we carried the following motions. Committee recommend the board that the board draft changes to the Community Works Funds Policy 3.2. That the purpose Community Works Funds allocation policy provide direction on who will be entrusted with allocating the Community Works Funds funding, as well as considering grant applications for Community Works Funds funding from outside agencies, so on and so forth. On the December 4th, 2024 Finance Committee, there were 2 policies attached to that agenda, and then it got tabled and referred to staff, and I believe that's why this report has come before us. But those 2 are actually 3 pages, 2 policies. I can't find them anywhere in the staff report. Were they missed, or are they coming back at a future date, or should I resubmit them onto a future agenda?
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I have the financial policy 3.12 Community Works Fund allocation policy. I'm sorry, did I miss some policies?
Yeah, the December 4th meeting, I submitted the original 2023 Community Works Funds policy, as well as a proposed draft policy that I wrote up and submitted for the December 4th, 2024 meeting. Those were then forwarded to staff as part of this motion, and I'm just wondering if they're coming forward at a later date, or is it part of this discussion, but it's just not included?
It was a 2013 policy is what it was.
Yeah, sorry, 2013.
Yeah, sorry. Just so we're getting our decade in the right. So yes, those were I did find those in the December agenda. They aren't here, but I guess the question maybe is can they form part of the discussion in a sense, and are they part of the thought process here? Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair. That's on me. I didn't attach them, and but the board can consider those. And would you like to? I guess that's what is the board's wish? Do you want me to come back? Want to table this and then come back when we have those reports in hand?
I'll ask the chair. If it's acceptable to the assembly, I'd still like to reference those documents. If it's not acceptable to the assembly, then I would refer this back to staff and ask for those documents. But if the assembly is okay with talking about them, because I think we've already seen them last year, I would be fine with moving forward.
I'll ask the assembly, and I think if it's what I'd suggest, if it's referring to them and then pulling out pieces that we can digest here, that seems fine. That's what I'm asking the assembly, if everyone's okay with that. And if it starts getting really complicated that we need those before us, well, then we need to at least refer or defer parts of this discussion until next meeting and have those included. Is that fair for everyone? Is anyone opposed to that? Okay. Carry on, Director Gisborne. I think you were not quite finished. And then Director Elliott, but were you
Oh, I
finished,
want to
Director?
respond to your question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yes, please.
The assembly.
Yeah, assembly,
Around
sorry.
process. So
Quite,
I
go
think
ahead.
it's great. I think it's great that we ask questions and get clarity on the report before us. If the intention is to reference materials that I don't have in front of me, it might be harder for me to have that conversation without it. It might be better to table it to our next finance committee, and I don't know if it's time sensitive or not, and so those are all weighing on my mind.
Okay, thank you. And what I would suggest before giving back to Director Gisborne, if we can advance the discussion today as much as we can, just while we're here meeting, while we got time, because we don't have to finalize it. If we can home in on information, maybe either see if there's any motions we can make, see if there's any movement we can agree on, see if there's any option we can come to, and if there's items that are still outstanding, we can, if it's too much for today or we need more that information before us, then we can refer that to the next finance committee meeting. Would be appropriate. So go ahead, Director Gisborne. I think you were.
Thank you, Chair. I think there's two issues with community works funds and the policy. The first is how the money is broken up and like where it goes. Does it go to regional services? Does it go to electoral area services? That's one issue. The second issue is who makes the decision? Like who is it that actually votes on community works funds? And the reason I bring up the previous policy is because the old policy, let me just make sure it's in front of me. This is the 2013 policy. Part 2 said electoral area directors will approve regional district community works funds, as in it's up to the electoral area directors. And then policy number 4 was in keeping with the spirit intent of the two distinct and separate funding streams and through courtesy and respect, the board will ratify projects and initiatives authorized by the electoral area directors. That's the old policy from 2013. Sorry.
Excuse me.
Okay. Now, the reason why I understand that we have a different policy before us is in 2016, the chair at the time removed the Rural Services Committee, which is the committee that I believe Director McCormick was referencing, where it was the electoral area directors that were the only voting members of that committee. The policy then said the board will respect the wishes of the Electoral Area Services Committee or Rural Services Committee. Most regional districts call it Electoral Area Services. We called it Rural Services. And as I understand, in 2016, that committee was abolished. We then had a proposed change to the Community Works Funds policy that came before us in 2020, based on a request from the board in 2018. And that request was that the board requests staff to amend the Community Works Funds policy to provide a checklist to determine how funding will be awarded to worthy projects. When the proposal came before us in 2020, the challenge was, and I brought this up, was that the policy was being changed to make the decision not by the electoral area directors, but by the board as a whole. I warned the board at the time that that would invite division into our discussions. And this would create more challenges for us in the future. The simple solution is to create the Electoral Area Services Committee or Rural Services Committee, whatever you call it, where it's the electoral area directors that have a committee, they meet on issues that affect electoral areas, they vote, and then the policy says the board will respect the electoral area director, the Electoral Area Services Committee. But that committee hasn't existed since 2016. What we're doing right now is looking at this new proposed policy about how we're going to carve up community works funds. And when I read this new policy, I see it as putting a lot of extra work onto staff, almost like where it's prescribing, board decisions. But of course, when we take a look at community works funds, we might have a whole bunch of money in Area C, but there might not be a big project in Area C. But then several years or several decades down the line, there is a big project, and that's why we do this pooling. The proposal is that we, can borrow from some and shuffle it around, and I see that as creating a lot of extra administrative paperwork. That comes with cost. And I think the proof is in the pudding before us. Policy in 2020, we didn't really seem to have a problem with how community works funds were being distributed in the organization. It was up to the electoral area directors. They would sit down at their electoral area services committee, they would have their meeting, and they would sort it out. Now what's happened is ever since I think 2022, we've had a plethora of requests for staff reports. And here we are with, what is it, 100 pages of staff report in front of us. And if we go ahead with this policy, I think it's going to create more work on our staff. When I think the solution is very simple. We bring back the Electoral Area Services Committee, which will bring us in alignment with, as I understand, all other regional districts with the exception of Central Coast because they have no municipalities. And that it is then up to the electoral area directors to figure it out. I don't think we should be splitting hairs over, you know, this goes to area B, this goes to area C, because for example, a lot of money that's been spent in area B has been spent on the Myrtle Pond water system. Now, does that benefit all of area B? Or does that just benefit the 84 parcels? When we look at the Malaspina Volunteer Fire Department and doing fire trucks, that benefits Area C and Area B. But then a question might be, well, is the fire truck going to hall number 1 or hall number 2? In which area? And you see how I'm splitting hairs here, right? Now, it's not staff's job to split hairs. It's the politicians' jobs to split hairs. And that's where we then come to an understanding of how we want to distribute these funds. Because for all of us around the table, on the electoral area directors, we have fire halls, with the exception of Texada Island. And that's why, thankfully, Director McCormick has brought this to our attention that improvement districts on Texada Island are eligible for community works funds, but our policy restricted their access to community works funds. That's why I think we're getting focused on the wrong problem. We're trying to figure out how we carve up community works funds rather than back to the original problem, which is who decides community works funds? Because when it ends up at the board and you have a weighted vote, the electoral area directors could vote unanimously one way and the municipal directors could vote unanimously a different way. And that's how we ended up in the problem of September 2024. That's why we're trying to change this policy, is to change how the decision is made on where that money goes. So I can't bring back the Rural Services Committee. The board can't bring back the Rural Services Committee. The chair can bring back the Rural Services Committee. So is there an appetite to bring it back for 2026, even if it was just to take a look at the Community Works Funds policy? And I'd be happy to move adoption of the Community Works Funds policy that I proposed on December of 2024, which is essentially the updated version from 2013, 2014, which says it's up to the electoral area directors to make the decision, and the board will respect the decision of the electoral area directors at the Electoral Area Director Services Committee. But it is contingent on, do we have that committee? That's my thoughts on it. Because there are some things like, for example, great example, the bike lane in Area B, like $800,000, actually went through the Regional Park Service because services are siloed, and that's how we were able to fund the active transportation. Now, does that mean it came from the region because it's a regional service, even though it only benefited Paget? That's what I mean by the splitting of hairs. That's the political arena that we play in. And that's why I think it should stay with the politicians. That's yes. You want to
I see corporate officer. I got it, Mark. Director Gisborne. Corporate officer, you have your hand up, I see.
Thank you, Chair. I just thought I should provide some sort of legislative advice here. And I don't have the exact words in front of me, but with regards to establishing a committee, the board has the ability to establish a select committee to deal with a specific item. So it does not have to just be a chair if that was a desire of the committee. We do have provisions within the Local Government Act to do that. With regards to wording in a policy, we want to ensure that we are not fettering the ability of the decision makers to use their free will. We actually legally can't do that. So we couldn't put it in a policy and then have that policy be adhered to, because legislation indicates that you have the right to vote in the way that you want to. So we would want to look at that language. Regardless, if a committee were to make recommendations, those recommendations do have to go up to the board to be voted on. So in the end, everybody would vote on it.
Yeah, so I see. Sorry, is this a follow-up question, Director Gisborne? Because there are others on the
Yes,
list.
follow up. My
Okay, go
reference,
ahead. And then
my
Director
reference
Elliott.
to rural services is that it's not a select committee, it's actually a standing committee. That's how it was in the past. As I understand, select committees are for a very specific purpose, and then they dissolve when they're done. My reference to rural services is as a standing committee. And when we come to the actual policy, I agree, you don't fetter the decision of the board. However, when reading other regional districts policies, they'll say community works funds, they got to get through that committee before it even gets to the board. Is how they're kind of laid out. Is the rural services committee is kind of like your gatekeeper. That's what I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about fettering the decision of the board, and I'm not talking about a select committee. I'm talking about a standing committee and aligning our policy with, what is it? Alberni Clayoquot is on our agenda. Yeah, sorry. That's just my clarification. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Director Elliott, and then I'll add myself.
Thank you, Chair. I think a policy is simpler than having an entire committee. I think a committee can do good work and provide recommendations, but they're no more binding than a policy is, because it still comes back to the same board at the end of the day with the same voting requirements. In order to restrict who can vote on the final decision, it has to be supported by legislation. And in this particular case, it's not supported by legislation to restrict voting to only the area representatives. And this is the conundrum we're trying to find a way around. What a policy does is it helps guide staff's planning and recommendations to us when things come forward. So they can say this particular option's within the policy that we create. Or alternative is you can do something out of policy. But then it's, us, the board, not following our own policies, which we have to hold ourselves accountable to or not. And that would be similar to a committee. A committee administratively has more burden than a policy. So I don't agree that we are putting less work for staff through a committee structure than we are for a policy. I think a policy simplifies things, and we can still address matters through the finance committee, which we already have running, and have an added policy that helps guide staff in how they're planning for projects and where the money goes and what they're recommending to us. Because they would recommend things consistent with policy. And then if we want to do something different than policy at the board level, we would have to have that discussion, and we can. Trying to make a structure that is legally supported, that includes only the area directors and excludes the city directors, requires an actual service, and you can't create a service for this fund, as far as I understand. Is that correct?
Corporate Officer, Ms. Greenan.
Thank you, Chair, through the chair. No, you cannot create a service. I've been confirmed with the financial analyst from the province. You cannot create a service for a fund.
And my other understandings about how the voting could be restricted is correct?
Ms. Greenan, or Corporate Officer, it's in your purview. Go ahead.
Yes, so thank you. Well, I will say this. So adopting a policy, the board does have an ethical responsibility to ground its decision-making in their adopted policies. So a policy should be a guiding document. Contradicting that could have ramifications. So if the policy says that this is how we will allocate the funds, then it would be expected that the board would follow those policies.
Is there anyone else who hasn't spoken first time? I have myself on the list, so I have a few questions. We don't have a motion, so this is mostly supposed to be about questions and clarifying what we get forward as motions. I like Director McCormick. I have I think I'd like to say I really appreciate the effort by staff. It's a huge complex issue. We've been talking about this for a long time and trying to find solutions, and it really helps for me to understand, A, this isn't a service. We can't go down that path. This can't be a service. B, we can have different ways of trying to make decisions, and we've talked about options with policy or committee or combination. But at the end of the day, if the final decision is going to be the board, so the board cannot, there is no, a committee and a policy cannot fully control what the board does. A board is free to make whatever motions it wants. Actually not allowed. But policies and committee recommendations don't have to be followed, but as the corporate officer just said, it's prudent to do so, and it's something that could be referred to. So I agree a lot with the comments by Director Elliott that a policy is less burdensome than a committee if we can get the wording right, and it's something we can try. We can always review it. That said, I also like a lot of the elements in the proposal put forward, but there's a couple questions I have that I really want to delve into, and three in particular. One related to how the amounts allocated to each electoral area are tracked, how we can balance equity, and a question about base funding. So really, I'll start with the tracking. So if we went with something like option 4, and forget the percentages for the moment, but an allocation to electoral areas, and an allocation for regional projects, and then tracking amounts. The question I have is that, as I understand it, this is not really like a really formal, specific accounting of exactly the allocations. It's more like tracking in a book entry system of here's what the allocation would be if we looked at the amount allocated, according to whatever formula we come up with. Here's how much would be allocated to each of the areas, and here's how much was actually spent. And then, so here's the kind of balance. Is that area been underspent or overspent? Is that more or less correct understanding, Ms. Green?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, my thought was that we would just have a spreadsheet. So right now we have a spreadsheet that shows the full funding and then, what area it's being spent in. We would just have a more detailed spreadsheet. So it would show, if you went with option 4, the 25% that was allocated to whatever priorities the board has, and then the other allocations to each area. And then instead of spending, when we put the spending, so if there was spending that was clearly from electoral area C, or let's say C, if it was, for example, if we decided to give some of that funding to the Lang Bay Community Hall for an upgrade or something, then that would be clearly spending from area C. And so that would be deducted from area C's allocation. And then there would be a balance, but we wouldn't be actually like posting those amounts into each area. There would still be there would still be the total funds available. And then as another example, if they decided to spend money for a fire truck for Malaspina Fire Department, then we would allocate a portion of that funding from area B and a portion of that funding from area C based on the, prorated based on the assessments. So at the end of the day, there would be a balance of, what each area still has in their pot, and then what each other area has in their pot. So it would just be a different spreadsheet. So instead of the spreadsheet that you see now, the spreadsheet would look different.
Thank you for that. And I think of it as given that as a kind of dashboard. So it's more like a snapshot of what the information we have had. No, with the caveats that we know when we allocate or when staff allocate projects to areas, it's not perfect. People use different services in different areas, different beneficiaries, but generally speaking, allocating it, attributing it to the area that benefits the most, either because of the service or because of the nature, location of the asset and who's using it. So I think that's actually makes a lot of sense to have that as a reporting like a dashboard to say, how are we doing? We expected to be about here in this electoral area, and we've spent way more in it or way less in it. And that's what we see in the staff report in the historic spending. And in particular, I'm thinking about Area C, because Area C has had, it would be really low on that historic spending, saying it was expected to be way higher, but actually it's a lot lower. And on that front, one of the things I did, and I really appreciated the information, but as everyone knows, I'm a numbers person. So I took the numbers provided in the report, but just focused on the electoral areas. To be able to compare electoral areas, I looked at just used the population, the relative percentage population in the EAs, in the electoral areas, compared to the spending in the electoral areas. So taking the city population and the projects outside electoral areas out of the equation. It changes the picture a little bit, so electoral area A isn't as high. That graph shows, 3.79, which is basically saying it's over almost 300% higher than what you'd expect. An expectation would be 1. And area C is at 0.42, meaning it's 40% of where you would expect. So when you do that calculation, it brings down things a bit. The area A is a bit over twice as high as what you'd expect with that, and area C is about a quarter. So there is still a big discrepancy. So that's related to this long-term equity, and it gets to when the tracking would start. So that's maybe my second question, is that if we this, I've thought about this quite a bit. If you start this tracking, this dashboard or this reporting, if we started from the beginning of the Community Works Fund, it may be seen as a challenge because of the changes in the eligible categories. We haven't, some areas have more eligible projects. It may also be seen as changing the rules after the fact, that we made decisions based on certain agreement and policies, and then now we're kind of changing it. However, if we started the dashboard right now, this reporting, in at the start of the current project, it sort of cements in that built-in inequity, I would say, for Area C in particular, that they, just because they haven't had projects, they're basically, can't make that up. So it's kind of like either and that shows up in the option D option. If we just started today or beginning of 2025, we start with the allocation for this year, and it's basically erases that inequity. So I have a concern about losing that. And that's speaking from a fairness point of view, because Area E, the numbers show, has been also benefiting, after Area A. So just in case Director Lennox thinks I'm picking on Area A, Area E is just close behind, and it's more like 50% higher than Area B and D are intermediate. So that's maybe the second question, is how, is there discretion in when we would start this, account, this reporting process of accounting for what the allocations were? How far retroactive can we go, or do we really need to start in 2025, 2026, 2024? What are our options there?
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair. I was recommending that we start from 2025 just for simplicity, just because it's sort of a clean slate. And the other rationale for that is that prior to 2025, I think the big thing is the fire trucks. Prior to 2025, you could spend on fire halls, but and you could spend on fire trucks as long as they were purchased, when you were constructing the fire hall. But now that fire trucks are a standalone, there is more eligible spending in each area, except Area D, of course, doesn't have fire trucks, but Area D does have lots of things that are eligible. The Texada Recreation, Texada Airport, there are lots of things in Area D that could be eligible. So now I want to address it by a different allocation of that beginning funding. Maybe there should be a higher allocation to Area C that didn't get as much funding in the past, for example.
Right.
If that's
And
what
maybe
is that what you're thinking?
that's what I'm thinking. And maybe, or along that lines, another option, and we're not going to resolve this entirely today, would be to take the existing funds that are left over from the previous reporting period. Because we have the previous period agreement, and then we got this future agreement. And in some senses, from a decision-making point of view, it seems to make sense to change the policy and have it affect the current agreement 2025 or 2024 to 2034. But then there's this money that's left over, and maybe looking at that equity there, and one, may not fully make up for Area C, but maybe you know, if there's 800,000 or around 1 million or something left over from, I don't know what the numbers are exactly, but some fairly large amount of money, maybe that could address that historical and basically start off Area C with, you know, with most of that or a large amount, and you know, D and B would have some of it, and then maybe areas A and E would start off at zero. We wouldn't get any of, we've already had our share. So that's maybe one idea, and I don't know what the answer is. I'm just putting it out there. And the last one is this allocation. I mean, I think we can talk about whether it should be 25-75 or 60-40. I think those are fair questions. But I think the idea of having regional, you know, a big part allocated to EA projects and a portion allocated to regional projects makes a lot of sense. One of the ideas I had, and I'll turn it into a question, is that when you look at the funding, you know, which is described at the beginning of the report, which just on page 3 of 4. Sorry, yeah, page 3 of 104, 3 of 104, describes how the funding formula is. So it's a base funding of 63,000, about 65,948, and a total funding of 422. So about 360,000 coming from the per capita. So there could be an argument to be made that $65,000 is given to the regional district, I would argue, for rural use, for the electoral areas, but as a whole, so equal. So the electoral areas are all in that boat together. So in other words, that should be for all the electoral areas, and the rest of it's per capita. So the per capita part makes absolute sense to base that on population. I think the funding formula is population. I think the allocation should be population. I think it's clear for the people. You're not saying one person has more per person than another because they've got different assessed values or different services or different other attributes. A person's a person, and it's $45 a person. That's the allocation. It may not all arrive there at the same time, but that's the tracking. But that 65,000, there could be an argument to say that that gets divided up equally among the electoral areas. In other words, this would be again, I'm throwing out an idea, but the rationale being that you would have the allocation would be the funding floor would be divided equally among electoral areas, which is about 15% of the funding. Say 20% would be allocated, or 20, 25, whatever the number is, for regional projects, and the balance would be allocated per capita to the electoral areas. So that's just a food for thought. We don't have a motion yet, but I'll leave it there and hand it over to anyone else. Ms. Greenan, and then Director Brander. Ms. Greenan.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chair. So that kind of is like option 2, where you take the floor and allocate that equally, and then do the balance on population.
Right. Thank you for pointing me to that. Okay, that's good. Director Brander.
Thanks, Chair. I really appreciate your comments. I never kind of know when to jump in at these moments because I never know where we cross from question to debate to discussion to whatever it might be. But I'm looking at the proposed motions in item 8.7, and I think the first one should be split. The first paragraph should be split. I think a formula, I actually have some motions that I came up with. I don't know if the corporate officer has them, but I'm not putting it up here to make the motion yet, just to kind of inform people of a different idea that I had. But the first one, I'm essentially saying what you're talking about is I would like to send it back to staff to ask for a formula that would look at the unallocated community works funds and come up with a formula that a minimum amount would be given to every electoral area, and then the remainder be given out to the electoral areas based on a formula based on, weight them historically based on what the community works funds have been allocated to the individual electoral areas. Because as the chair mentioned, the residents of Area A have received essentially 10 times what the residents of Area C have received in the past. And this would just be one of those ways to balance that out, because we've talked about that in the past, about trying to balance out the community works funds. And then as far as the second part goes, I had originally written up 20% to be distributed between the 5 electoral areas equally. That's more or less the same thing as what the chair has suggested, taking the 65,000 and distributing it equally. I thought 20% set to regional needs, and then 60% set to the electoral areas based on population. My thoughts being that if we have 20% set aside for regional needs, that can be allocated to the individual areas should they need it, because I understand that some of the areas with smaller populations have a harder time with large purchases. Again, I'm getting into debate here. I don't want to go there. I just wanted to get these options on the floor so that people could consider them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for putting. Okay, so is there anyone else who hasn't spoken yet on this round? And we don't have a motion yet, so we've got to try to refrain from going too far down the road into debate. As Director Elliott has not spoken yet, I believe. So go ahead.
I did, but it was.
Oh, you did?
It was for
Okay, for
clarity.
clarification. Okay, Director Elliott, and then I believe Director Gisborne had his hand up a moment ago. So go ahead.
I kind of like what Director Brandner's saying about maybe fleshing out some options we might like to see, and then bringing, kicking it back to staff for a bit and then coming back forward again. I have just a couple of questions and some thoughts on that. I think what's existing in unallocated funds from past years could be probably used as divided initially as a one-time only balancing of equity among areas. And then the go forward could be done allocated like in option 4 or whatever it is you guys think is the best way to go. And so the current historical amount that is accumulated in the account could be used in a different and separate way than the ongoing ones coming in. And I think that might be the easiest way to start off this new policy. So that's and whatever option matches that would be great. And so it's not a floor every year. It's not, it's go forward basis. New funds would be allocated by population. The past accumulated funds would be allocated in a one-time basis through areas in order to try to create some equity from our historical use of the fund. And that's kind of what I would be hoping to see if it was to come back, and maybe one of those options is that, and I just didn't read it that way, but that was my thought on that.
Thank you for that. Director Gisborne had his hand up next. I don't see anyone else with their hand up, but go ahead.
Yeah, I hope I don't sound too annoyed. We're talking about a policy that prescribes how the funds are going to be divvied up based on population and regional and electoral area. And, we could spend all day talking about what works for which projects, but I do believe that community works funds are very context sensitive. It really depends on what is the initiative that is being supported, whether it's an improvement district fixing their water system, or an improvement district being converted to a regional district service, or active transportation. And what I want to point out to everyone is that we're talking about coming up with policies and frameworks so that the staff can try and thread that needle. Where our previous policy was 1 page long, and all of this political wrangling was up to the elected officials. And they would meet with their standing committee of the Electoral Area Services Committee, and they would go through this about what's equitable, what's fair, what projects and what priorities are important. And what we're doing is, well, we've asked for staff report after staff report, and now we're trying to prescribe which areas get which portions of which funding. And that comes with a cost. Every time we don't do something and ask staff to do it, that comes with a cost. And that's why I have a real problem going this route. I think it's simple, and I think we're having a great conversation around the table as to what's equitable, what's fair, and I think the electoral area directors have a really good head on their shoulder, and we can go through the history based on how much is available and why funding was distributed in certain areas. Back to the Paget Road thing, as I understood it, we had a bunch of money sitting in the account and we had to spend it. And we were able to partner with Ministry of Transportation to actually get the road widened. Now, things have changed. We can actually put that money towards fire trucks. So yes, a lot of money went up to Area A for their sewage treatment system, because that's an eligible funding criteria under Community Works funds. But at the time, we couldn't really spend the money on anything else. So yes, Lund got a lot of that money in the past. Does that mean that they should be penalized going forward? Those are really good discussions, and those are really good points, and those are political discussions. And that's why when it comes down to something like politics of where the money goes, I think that should stay with the elected officials, not to write a prescriptive policy, because keep in mind, in about a year from now, we're going to be going into an election and the new board might come in and want to change the policy. I think keep it simple, have a rural services committee, have it referenced to go to the rural services committee. The electoral area directors, I presume, are clever and smart. We are. And we can sort out where we want the funding to go, because there will be things, for example, a regional service, such as the Resource Recovery Center. That was one that was floated. We said, hey, let's put some community works funds to the regional service of solid waste management. However, that was contingent on, will the municipality cough up an equal portion or a comparable portion? The municipality decided not to. So that's on a case-by-case basis. If we're into the future and we come into a similar situation, the municipality does want to partner with community works funds, then great. We as the electoral area directors controlling that money could decide on an electoral area services committee to partner with the municipality. But if the municipality doesn't want to partner with any community works funds with us, then I'm opposed to putting any money towards regional projects that are, inside city limits. And that's where it's context sensitive. It's a case-by-case basis. I don't think having a prescriptive policy is going to get us anywhere. It's just going to create more problems, more headaches, and then in the future, the board is going to ask for more staff reports and more policies, and it's going to go around and around in circles. And in the end, we had a policy, it worked great. We had a committee, it worked great. And, it's not surprising to hear municipal directors opposing the Rural Services Committee, because that sounds like deja vu from 2016.
We don't need to comment about what the city directors feel or don't feel, but Director Lennox, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I appreciate the comments. I see some other hands here, and yeah, context is everything. I mean, when I think about community works funds, I don't think I've actually voted for hardly any in Area A. I've inherited some and appreciate that. I guess my thoughts on the use of the funds, I want to maintain flexibility. I think if we pigeonhole ourselves into, well, you get this much and this much, then you tend to just, that's my account, right? You get into like that's kind of an intuitive thing. Whereas I'd like the flexibility to say, depending on the context of the time, we need a fire hall in Area C, we need whatever it is. When I look back at the community, this large list of everything on here is important from the report here. It doesn't appear to me that, Area A, B, C, these are just all things that occurred at that given time. So going revisionist kind of history I don't think works very well, going back and trying to say, well, we should have done this or should have done that, and this is how much money. So I appreciate the efforts other directors are trying to, with the fund that's there. I mean, an example is one of the other items we have on our agenda. There's now a proposal to use some community works funds for the Lund fire truck. Guess why? We weren't allowed to do that until recently. Right? And our staff did a good job by identifying that. And of course, what am I going to do as a director? Say, yeah, I don't want to tax our people. So again, at that moment in time. And, Lund is its own example. Area A is its own example. There's infrastructure there that was not managed well, folks. So, if there's areas, infrastructure in your area that's not managed well, we probably will have to deal with it. So I guess what I'm saying is I really get the attempt at sort of being fair. What I'd like to be fair about is if it's important to the board, it's important, and that we fund it if we can. When I look at the practices of the other regional districts, it is the electoral areas that, directors that look at this and usually make recommendation to the board. That seems appropriate to me. Because of some of the other issues too about city directors, city works funds, like there's that conversation. So looking at it from a electoral area perspective is a good thing. So I don't mind I'll say participating in another committee that looks at this important subject, because this is an important subject and it will continue to be. And we got other big ticket items coming at us. I mean, I haven't made any suggestions for the use of community works funds for Area A. Why? Probably because historically we've gotten more than our fair share. But like I said, we've had projects, infrastructure that demanded it. And this board in the past made that decision. So just some of my thoughts. I appreciate the discussion.
Okay, thank you. And we just noting we don't have a motion on the table. So I see Director McCormick had her hand up, and I see Director Southcott who hasn't spoken yet. So I'll recognize Director Southcott first, and then I'll end our preliminary comments and see if we can actually get any actions. So go ahead, Director Southcott, for your first time.
Thank you, Chair. There were lots of disputes or discussion that went on years ago over Community Works Fund at the city. And interestingly, as I reflect back to that, which there haven't been a whole lot, in more recent years compared to before, the discussions were more around values than who got what. And the values really oriented towards needs of the community. And when I think about taking that tack, and I've appreciated the report, detailed, and and I read it carefully. And when I got to the end of it, I thought about it, and I didn't have any more clear feeling than I did at the beginning of it as to how, what the different options, what option I would choose. And it's because I reflect back to what are the true needs. And here's another element too. I mean, that's a question that is a kind of a global question in my mind always. Another question is, how does this all work out over a long period of time? Because at one point in time, one area will have a need, and at another point in time, another area will have a need. And then to make it even more complicated, who within the whole community uses the money that's spent in one area or another? I mean, we all go all over the region and enjoy amenities that are in various different areas. And these are things that are extremely difficult to quantify. So I don't know if they'd even be possible to quantify, because you'd have to figure out a system to quantify them. I don't know if we'd ever get there. So, and this gets me back to, reflecting on the conversation we've had so far today. We're trying to, it feels to me like we're struggling towards trying to quantify decision making. So where this leaves me is with the feeling that I don't personally really care that much about what option is utilized, because when you look at that page 7 graph, it shows to me, or I am guessing, I am expecting from that decisions have been made according to need. And there has been, in the past, and that graph covers quite a span of years. And I think we probably, regardless of how we decide to divide this up now, it's very likely we will come back to what the need is and who needs it within the community. And so dividing it down according to equal shares, et cetera, is probably going to ultimately end up taking kind of a secondary role anyway, because we do have the ability to be flexible. So I almost wasn't going to express this, but I think it's important, because I think we can really give ourselves a headache by trying to quantify our decision making, where we really are qualitative people. And so I'll just reiterate it at the risk of redundancy, that I personally don't, and obviously being a city director here, I don't really feel I have much to offer in terms of how this is divided in the between the electoral areas. But I really feel that's probably where we'll end up, even at the board level, debating who needs what. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Southcott. And Director McCormick. Oh, you're on mute. You're muted.
It was going to be good.
Sorry,
okay.
I'm usually good about that. Anyway, I am prepared and I will make a recommendation at the end of what I'm going to say. But I believe when I look at the four options that are in the report, um, I do like the one that was put forward, option 4. I like it because of the flexibility to use funds from one area if there's an excess to help another area or to pool it for regional projects. But I really like the fact that 75% is earmarked for needs of the electoral areas. And I think that's a really good way to go. I think staff have done a lot of work on this going back several years in the research and the interviews and the surveys of other regional districts. There's a lot of time that has gone into the information that we've got before us. So I don't want to ask staff for another report. I think we've got the information here. It is up to us to make a decision. I am prepared and I will move the recommendation that is in the package, option 4, because I am quite satisfied that that will get to where I was hoping to go with this issue, which is allocation directly to the electoral areas. So I'm satisfied with the flexibility built into that option and with, hopefully the good result that will result in a lot of projects coming forward that might not have had the opportunity otherwise. So, yeah, Chair, I will move the recommendation that's in our package, option 4.
Okay, is there a seconder for the motion that's put forward? Looking kind of quiet out there. Oh, Director Southcott. Okay, so it's been moved and seconded. So we have on the table option 4. So Director Gisborne, then Director Brander.
So option 4 in the package, a couple of motions, and I just want to make sure I've got the right one. The second part of the motion, because it's a two-parter, has an and, I see it. That staff propose amendments to Community Works Funds Policy 3.12 to provide that beginning in 2025, annual funding be distributed 25% towards pooled regional or EA priorities, with the remaining 25% of funds allocated to the electoral areas based on population. Is that the motion that we have before us?
Yes.
Okay. One of the reasons why we're in this challenge is last September, there was kind of a strong arm tactic to try and take the electoral area directors, the EA Community Works funds, and put it towards the Resource Recovery Center. This motion would still allow 25% to be sitting there to be allocated towards things like the Resource Recovery Center without any commitment from the municipality. So I actually don't support this motion because I think 100% of the electoral area community works funds should remain in the electoral areas or be at the discretion of the electoral area directors. So that's why that's why I don't actually support this motion. And really, I think it doesn't solve the problem that we ran into last year, which was the catalyst for revisiting this, which was, who is it around this table that makes the decision? Yes, it is ultimately the board. However, we've read lots of policies from other regional districts where these projects have to be reviewed by the Electoral Area Services Committee prior. So I actually don't support this motion because I think it's still missing the problem. And I don't think we need any more staff reports, but I do think that we need the proposed policy from December 2024. So I guess notice of motion, I'll bring that before a future finance committee meeting.
Notice of motion noted. Director Brander.
I would just like to split the first part of the motion off.
Okay, so the first clause has been split off. Okay, so we're going to continue debate on the first part, which is that the committee recommend to the board that the board direct staff to allocate the 2025 unallocated opening balance of the CWF to each EA based on population. So Director Brander made the motion, then I see Director Gisborne. Director Brander, go ahead.
Earlier on, I would like to see the unallocated funding be weighted so that we can take this as an opportunity to balance how much the residents of the different electoral areas have received and will receive, I guess, in the future. No, I would like to send this back to staff to have the formula.
Is that a motion to send that back to staff, or is it,
Sure,
wait?
I'll make the
Okay.
motion, yeah.
It's a motion. Director Brander made a motion to refer this back to staff to look at weighting options.
And
Director
I see
Elliott?
quite a discrepancy between some of the electoral areas, and electoral area C comes out in the short end of the stick in a big way. So I think the residents of area C and other areas as well who have been shortchanged deserve a bit of consideration.
Okay, was that a seconder, Director Elliott?
Yes.
Okay, so discussion on now the motion before us is to refer that first clause to staff to look at, weighting options. Director Gisborne.
Yeah, I think it's just putting more work on staff for something that was originally covered by a one-page policy, and that is up to the elected officials to determine what's fair for each of the electoral areas. So I get the intention, but I just see this as adding more work to staff's plate when the work really should be done by the elected officials. So I don't support this motion.
Director McCormick.
Thank you. And I will also speak against the motion. I think we've all kind of come to terms with the idea of allocation based on population. And that's really what this motion says, is that allocation will be based on population. And I see no reason to send it back to staff for yet again another report. We've got enough reports. We need to make a decision.
Okay, thanks. So any other discussion on this item? So Director Lennox.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It is pretty clear. I mean, again, I can't speak to the decisions of the past, and I won't defend them or promote them. I think it's everybody understands, and my constituents would understand the what we're talking about. I don't think people have been shortchanged. I think the board at the time made decisions to support the community in whatever region it was done, and they did. We supported the community with those funds. Thanks.
Okay, so any other? Director Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. I would support the motion to send it back because I think that the accumulated unexpended money from the community works that have come in the past have been allocated based on priorities and past decisions, and we're not trying to revisit that. We're just trying to acknowledge that not all areas are starting out in the same spot. And so to be treating them equitably right now when they may be starting from behind is maybe not the fairest way to start out this policy. And so I think it's okay to have, well, what would the numbers look like if we were trying to create a little bit of equity with the funds that are currently in the basket, and having those on the table for the board to consider before making a decision about those past funds. And it's different than the go forward second part of the motion. And so I support sending just that section back so we can look at what that might look like.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further? Director Southcott.
Thank you, Chair. So a question with regard to this. It seems to me that this motion won't require staff to do as much analysis and work as the production of this lovely report that was 100 pages long. And I just want to confirm that to ask staff, Manager Linda, if you think that this is really a large piece of work that is being sent back to you.
Ms. Green, is it clear what would be requested if this passed, and would it be a lot of work?
Thank you, Chair. No, I don't see it. It's basically a spreadsheet, a calculation process. And no, I don't see that being an onerous task or an onerous report.
Thank you.
Okay, so is there any further discussion? Director Brander.
I just want to make one more comment. In the past, this board has said that we wanted to have some sort of a dashboard, some sort of a way of making sure that the different electoral areas are being treated fairly equitably. We have an opportunity here to do something to sort that out a bit. At least bring them a little bit closer together. And as we've heard from the staff, to have a report, to come up with a formula would be very easy to do. I don't know why we wouldn't go forward with it. Thank you.
And I'll just say my comment for the first time, which is I agree with that. I think, it's one thing to, we're not, in my view, we're not trying to make things add up to zero exactly. But if we were more or less similar, if the past spending had been more or less similar, it would be a different story. But when Area C has really been underfunded, we want to, I like the idea of starting the new agreement period fresh with a new policy and new rules and so on. But I think looking at least at the funding that we have available under the old agreement that's in the fund right now, I think the options would be able to address that inequity a bit, and it's kind of reconciling that difference in the past. Because had we known, this is one of the challenges I raised about changing rules. If had we known, if we'd had this policy from the beginning that we're considering the rest of the motion that's on the table, we might make decisions differently. And that might have affected decisions if we had pluses and minuses, if we had this allocation. So, how would we have made those decisions differently? I'm not sure, but we can't go back and revisit the past because the past's the past. But we aren't in the past, we're in the present. What we are is in a present where we've spent some funding in different areas and we have some funding, and Area C has been underfunded for various reasons. Maybe there hasn't been the appropriate projects. Maybe the next big project's just waiting down around the corner down there. So I think that's something for us to really consider. That would be something that would be appropriate for the taxpayers of Area C. So I'm in favor of this motion. And I saw Director Gisborne.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just looking at the report. We have the opening balance. We have the populations. We have, if the opening balance was distributed based on the historical spending, Area C has been underfunded. Passing this motion won't actually rectify that. What rectifies that funding disparity is spending the money in Area C. Asking for a report doesn't fix that. Spending the money on projects in those electoral areas does. So if the motion was, hey, we need a new fire hall in Area C, let's put the money, yeah, let's do it. And I would be happy to cough up extra funding from Area B because of the historical inequity. When we go to spend money, it is a political decision around this table. And one of the things that makes me really concerned about such a policy is it puts the staff in a position of prescribing, to the board, hey, this is how much money should be spent with this or that. And that was something I believe in the 2020 report around Community Works Funds policy. I believe our CIO actually suggested that that's actually not a good idea. Really, it's up to the elected officials. So if there's any initiatives in Area C that we can put in our budget, I would love to know about it. But simply asking for this information, which I think is already in the report, it doesn't in those areas. And it's like we're dancing around the issue to try and say, hey, this is how we want it to be fair in an ideal world. But as we've gone around the table, which is great, I'm loving the conversation. We've talked about the historical inequities. We've talked about the funding limitations. We've talked about the policy changes. We've talked about the various needs. Like, this is a great example that Community Works Funds is such a large and complicated issue with a lot of politics behind it from a lot of different electoral areas, that it's not necessarily appropriate to break up the funding through a policy to try and solve our problems. And one of the things was like, well, a committee, it's more onerous, it has more work, whereas we can just have a policy. But the issue with that is if you have a policy, it's the staff that have to do the work, and they get into a difficult position to try and make these recommendations of what they think the board might think is fair. But a committee means that that decision stays with us. And we're the ones that have to wear the decision of, are we treating other electoral areas fairly when it comes to the sharing and the distribution of the Community Works Funds? Because we're going to still have to, fight those battles. And we're going to have to be able to go to our constituents. And sometimes we'll say, hey, we got a bunch of money for our area. And our constituents might go, yeah, but you're not being fair to the folks on Texada or the folks in Area C. And that's that, our residents, they want us to, of course, get them the best deal, but they also want us to be fair with all the other residents in our region. So I think this decision-making process needs to stay with the elected officials. And we have the information, we have the historical spending, we have the distribution based on population. We've got all the information that we need. And I think the next step is to actually start taking a look at the projects that we want to spend money on and to have that decision be made by the electoral area directors and then have it be recommended to the board or where that funding goes, which is in alignment with the policies from other regional districts. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I'll remind the committee we're talking. Hopefully, we get too soon. Director Lennox, go ahead.
What I was saying.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chair, and appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, where do I start here? I appreciate the comments Director Gisborne just raised around what we're attempting to do, and I guess I'm just going to come back to the point about flexibility. A question for staff as well. So if areas are pooling funds, you know, sort of channeling those funds, whatever percentage it may be, into, I'll just use Area A. If there were no projects to come on the horizon, which Area A, unfortunately, that'll never happen, it seems like, but responsive tax, that's still taxpayers' money. So I think you see my question is that, would an area end up maybe developing a nest egg? And I guess what I'd say to echo your Director Gisborne's comments, I'd love to find out if there was a project in Area C, Area E, D, anywhere else that we need to talk about. But I just haven't heard it, and I haven't heard it for a while. So therefore, what's the effect of stockpiling all this money? Only, you know, what effect will that have? Do we lose it? I mean, those types of things.
Okay, so that's a bit off the topic of the motion, which is to refer this, but we do have a question. So there's a question there, so I'll let it go through to the. That's okay. It's just that is on the next piece. But anyways, that's Ms. Greenan, the question. Could you rephrase your question, Director Lennox? Because you had a question about.
I think I have it.
You got it. Okay, right. Okay, good.
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair, yes, there is always that risk of developing a nest egg because the funds do have to be spent within 5 years. So the money that we have coming forward from the beginning of 2025, that has to be spent by 2030. But the thing that, you know, my thinking though is that the categories in the community works funds have opened up significantly. So, you know, with the fire trucks and also with the disaster mitigation, or disaster resilience, sorry. Like, for example, the next report that you're going to see, we're recommending that, you know, that they use $150,000 of community works towards a fire truck at Northside Volunteer Fire Hall Department. And but the concern is that we're asking that because they don't have enough money in reserves. You know, so if another service like Malaspina happens to have money in reserves, then we might not ask for that funding because they have the funding, so we don't need to ask. And so I just feel like this does give us a little more guidance. So we could say, okay, you know, there is money, for example, in Area C now, we could use it towards that fire truck instead of using reserves. So that's my concern. But yes, there is always that concern with not pulling them, that the funds could build up.
Thank you. Thanks for your example of that necessary flexibility. That was a perfect example. Thanks.
Okay, so we have the motion of referring the first clause of the motion on the table. So the first clause of option 4 to staff. Have we had sufficient discussion? Okay, seeing no more hands up. So I'm going to call the question on referring this item to staff for looking at options to weighting funding. Allocations, I should say. So I'll call the question. All those in favor? Not in favor. Opposed? 3 opposed. Director McCormick, Director Lennox, and Director Gisborne. It passes. Okay, so we're on to the second part of the clause, which is the remainder of option 4, which is 25% towards pooled regional or EA priorities, 75% allocated by population with flexibility to borrow funds, but shift funds between EAs with tracking repayments and flexibility to contribute proportional shares towards board prioritized projects. So that was already moved. So Director McCormick had made it. So we were continuing discussion, I guess, on that. Director Gisborne, go ahead.
gonna call a point of privilege. Do you have a bio break? I'm squirming in my chair.
Okay, so let's cogitate for a moment, take a 5-minute break, and come back and hopefully continue.
Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome.
Better get up.
Wait for the recording, hang on. Yes.
Recording in progress.
Okay, welcome back. We just had a little break and we will continue discussion on the Community Works Fund. We have on the table the second part of a motion to put forward option 4. And we will continue discussion on that second portion. So
Something happened.
wind blew.
Sunday? Wow, no.
No, I'm up in my office and because our meeting's gone on for quite a while, the
It's changed.
western sun is coming around. Okay, Director Elliott, go ahead.
So in response to the idea around flexibility, this motion talks about the flexibility to do exactly what we've been doing in the past, and which means that we're tracking where the money's going, and we're generally trying to allocate it in a 75-25 way, and that's kind of the policy. And the flexibility is there for this committee, the Finance Committee, to look at various projects and maybe overspend in one area or another, and make that up in another year over time. And so that flexibility isn't going anywhere. It's just creating targets for us to generally try and be more equitable than we have in the past. The extensive list of projects that qualify now will eliminate the problem we had in the past where there aren't any projects in a particular area, because the categories are so broad that every area can benefit from projects now, because lots of projects are eligible. And so you're not going to have the same issues that you've had in the past. That flexibility is built into this policy. This Finance Committee can debate between the areas on projects the way we've always done. And so that's not going anywhere. And so I think this is a pretty good policy.
Director Gisborne.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to quote something. Some regional districts divide up funding to each electoral area based on population to be used for specific electoral area projects. The QRD has never exercised this procedure, and nor should it, as project valuations are often high, and it could possibly take years for a small population-based electoral area to accumulate enough funds to tackle a project. Rather, the practice here has been to allocate whatever amount the CWF is required or available based on the need of the project, no matter where it is located. That is referencing the staff report from 2020 when we changed this policy to what it currently is. I agree that we need to be equitable when we spend our community works funds. And I agree that Area C and some areas, this policy or this proposed policy change, one, doesn't actually fix the problem of municipal directors, electoral area directors, that whole thing that we ran into last year. Ironically, the last vote that passed, a majority of electoral area directors were opposed. So it's proving my point. I don't think this solves that problem. But what it does do is it says, hey, staff, can you guys track these numbers for us? We can track them. We have them. They're in the report. What this is doing is we're saying, hey, staff, can you do more of our job for us as elected officials? That's not the way I prefer to govern. I think we can resolve these equity issues by spending the money in the areas that need it based on the project values. And I think the challenge that was the catalyst for this was a municipal director trying to take the electoral area community works funds for the Resource Recovery Center. That's why this whole thing got started up. That's why we ended up asking for this report again. And now here we are, but we're not actually addressing what the problem was. We're still not addressing what the problem was. We're dancing around it, which means that unless we actually deal with the problem, maybe it'll be a year, maybe it'll be 4 years, but that problem is going to return. And I look at it and I go, well, other regional districts have solved it by amending their policy or not changing their policy. And I think that we should be more in line with the other electoral area directors and other regional districts. And I think this is just doubling down on a policy that's caused us problems. I'm not in favor. Sorry, Chair.
Don't be sorry to me. You have a motion. You can vote in favor or against. I'll add myself on too. I don't see anyone else's hand up. Let's check with Director McCormick.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Director McCormick, and then I'll go after you.
Okay, well, I just wanted to clarify, Chair, that what we're voting on is the second paragraph of this motion.
It's actually the second and third together right now.
Second and third. Okay.
We could split it again, but
No. I
Okay.
support the policy.
I think we can probably get there, but I would say you could focus on the 2575, whether that's 2575 versus 2080 or whatever, and that can be revised when we look. I think there's a concern that by that the language of allocating to electoral areas and then this borrowing, the language of borrowing and lending, is a bit problematic to some because it seems like even if it's a dashboard or monitoring, it's putting funding in boxes in different categories and then saying we're over or under, and then maybe getting up to 5-year thresholds where we have different packets. I think maybe we could keep the essence of that and back away from it a bit. We could specify that the target, let's say in the motion, 25%, sorry, 75% for electoral areas, is actually a target. And I'll give some suggested wording, but I think staff would probably need time to think about it. But rather than saying, so for example, if it says the policy beginning in 2025, the annual funding is distribute 25% towards pooled regional or EA priorities. That seems pretty simple and straightforward. That's basically saying there's a certain percentage that can be spent on whatever the collective body wants. With the remaining of the funds allocated to EAs, that part's fine, based on population. And rather than just saying that, it could say, with the remaining 75% of funds allocated to EAs with a long-term objective of spending based on population. So in other words, it isn't a specific allocation, it's an objective of meeting that. So we would have the target of trying to balance things over time rather than this more rigid dividing things up. And to that end, rather than mentioning borrowing funds, it could be the flexibility to borrow funds from the second part of the motion could be changed to something like the policy would include tracking is that dashboard. What it would look like is basically the table we have in this report. So it would say, here's the funding, here's the spending we've had for CWF by EA over time. And as we track it, so if we started fresh, suppose we started, clear the sheet for the new term, 2024 to 2034, we'd say, okay, we're all at zero. We get this allocation, which is part of this motion. And then over time, we start spending it. And I agree completely. It's actually on the ground, shovels in them for Malaspina Fire Department. We might say, let's spend CWF to relieve the taxpayers from that. So that would take away this idea that it's actually really rigid and it's just up and, the more fixed. It would keep it more political as directors. We need to, we want to follow that policy. We can only get so far away from that anyways, because ultimately it's a board decision. So that's what I would like to propose. And then, the only other aspect of this that I'm not as in favor of, but I mean, I can live with, which is this, allocation of the base funding, but, 20% each to the 5 EAs, because that's basically how it's allocated. But I see that as something that might be able to be either brought in, that element could be brought in if needed, if desired, I should say, if supported, or in a future revision. So I'm going to leave it there and just see what the rest of the assembly would like to do with that. But I would be in favor of taking those concepts, supporting option 4, but with some adjustments to reduce some of the rigidity in the language, focusing on the information and setting these objectives for how the spending is, the allocation is the intention as a objective spending rather than splitting the account up. But I'll leave it there and see.
Either way, I think the motion talks about flexibility for the board to borrow. It doesn't mean that we have to use those words. I think the staff can create the best words possible to allow for those flexibility and still be within the motion. So I guess I'm going to ask the question of staff that the concerns that Director Fall was talking about in wording, could they be addressed if the motion moves forward as is?
Ms. Greenan?
Thank you, Chair, through the chair. Yeah, I'm thinking about it when you were saying it, and yes, I think we could work with the flexibility that we're trying to talk about and see how what we come up with. When we do work with the flexibility that we're trying to talk about and see how what we come up with. When we do create the policy, we're going to use these elements, and the policy still will come back to you for consideration and approval. So you can look at what we're proposing and see if it makes sense to you.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that makes sense.
I just wanted to, he thinks it isn't, because that's what this entire policy is about.
Evaluate all proposed projects and initiatives that meet the eligible criteria and guidelines of CWF. That had complete flexibility for the electoral area directors to meet and decide. So I think I did put out a notice of motion to consider the policy that we considered last December, and that would make it flexible to say, hey, it's up to the electoral area directors to meet and decide how the electoral area funds go. Pretty simple to me, pretty straightforward, pretty flexible, avoids the problems that we had last year because we changed the policy away from its original intent, and then we ran into the problem. Now here we are a year later, asking for more paperwork, more staff reports, and adding more criteria to a policy. Meanwhile, the public are constantly telling me they're concerned about the ever-increasing amount of taxes. But of course, every time we ask the staff to write paperwork, it costs money. That's the reality of governance. It's not a criticism of anyone other than, of course, I guess, the board and the assembly. I do believe when that issue was put to bed, we didn't put 25% towards the community works funds towards the Resource Recovery Center. When it came down to it, we said, no, we'll do borrowing to cover up the difference. But this motion would say, hey, it's up to, we could put 25% aside for those regional or EA priorities. If it was EA priorities alone and not regional, I'd be a little bit more comfortable, but still, I think it comes down to a case-by-case basis. We're trying to write a policy that is a catch-all and then puts our staff into an awkward position of keeping track of it, monitoring it, and then evaluate. Really, I think the best way to do it is, when we get into our budget, the staff can come forward and say, hey, here's all the eligible projects, and here's here's the list of the need, here's the list of everything, and then the electoral area directors sit down, have all the information in front of us, and we make that political decision. It's about being responsible and being flexible, and we were.
I look forward to the next month. I hope your notice of motion there. When I look at what's proposed here in what we're looking at now, it appears to me that's what we've been doing historically anyways. Looking at it, prioritizing, and then the board makes a decision, which is this last bullet point, flexibility to do just that. So why do you define it? Why do you need to define it and go through the kind of performative thing there? The first bullet point also, I got some questions around little ephemeral to quote unquote borrow. What does that mean? So what are the repayment terms? How long would it take a small area to crawl their way out from underneath a large project if they were to borrow? And when it says for the board to borrow funds, does that mean the board could actually take those funds against the objective of a director? Because it says the board, right? So, I mean, these are why when you see the definitions and the policies that other areas, regional districts have created, they define that, right? So, the more I think about it, pigeonholing us into policies where we sort of have flexibility, who's deciding? It's sort of that original point. So those are the things I've raised here. Thanks.
And well, you asked a question for Ms. Green, which I'll pass over to her about the meaning of borrowing. But if you note, there's quotes around it all through. So it's not actual borrowing. This is a reporting mechanism. It's more or less what we've seen. I mean, I think regardless of how we go, I'm debating. I won't debate. I'll pass it to Ms. Green and I won't jump in out of turn. But the meaning of borrowing is actually a reporting mechanism. I understand it. And Ms. Green may clarify better than I.
Thank you, Chair, through the chair. Yes, that's what it was intended for. It just meant that You know, for example, in Area D, you know, if we know that in Area D, they have a big project coming up in 6 years, but they don't have any big projects coming in the next 5 years, then we could, you know, use some of those funds for another EA, and then that EA doesn't potentially have a project coming up in 6 years. So then they would, you know, that would then bring the target back up. So the target would be exceeded in the one area, you know, maybe for a few years, but then it would go back and be available for the other area when their project is ready.
Thank you for that. And I see Director Brander and then Director McCormick. Hopefully we can get to a vote on this eventually, but
Yeah,
Director Brander, go ahead. No, I think it's your first time speaking on the second piece, so no offense meant, but go ahead.
I just want to clarify a few things. I asked the corporate officer to keep me in line, make sure I got this correct. There's been some discussion about who makes the decisions, and the concept of the Rural Services Committee, a standing committee, has been brought up, which is the decision of the chair, whether we have one or not. And at the end of the day, any Rural Services Committee has to report to the board. The board has to make the decisions at the end of the day. So the municipal directors can't be kept out of that decision-making process, which means they could decide to allocate the community of works funds wherever they want. Decisions would be elevated to the board level, and the municipal directors would be in the dark, essentially, because they hadn't been included in the discussions at the Rural Services Committee about the community works funds. Now, we actually do have
in that vote.
Right, okay, of course, but that wouldn't be the case in a Rural Services Committee. Right, thank you. Okay, so that is the reasoning behind not going for the Rural Services Committee. I believe that's probably why it was eliminated initially, because it left out the municipal directors who still had a vote in it, a weighted vote, which means they had more power than the rest of us all added together. I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Director McCormick was next, and then I see Director
Thank you. As the only person around, Rural Services never had the ultimate vote. Their recommendations were always voted on by the full board. But nonetheless, because the municipal directors were not included as committee members, they felt, you know, we're not included in the discussion, yet we're being asked to vote. That doesn't seem right. So that's kind of what happened there. So I think any thought that, and that's why my first question when we got to this item was, how do they do it? The areas where the regional district, the electoral area directors have the final vote, how do they do it? I'd still like to know that, I guess, because obviously there is a way. But rural services or electoral area services isn't the route to get there. So I don't know what the route is, but I would at some point like to find out.
Okay, thanks. Director Gisborne, we're heading into round 3 here, so we should go ahead.
I'm glad we're talking about Rural Services Committee or the Electoral Area Services Committee. I do recall the conversation that happened, though I was not present at the time. As I'm aware, every other regional district in the province, with the exception of ours and Central Coast Regional District, has a electoral area. So, hey, we want to use this for a shared regional facility or something like that. The directors can say, whoa, hold on. Our policy is it has to go through the Electoral Area Services Committee first. That's how the projects get evaluated. So when it gets to the board, you're absolutely right. The municipal directors have every right to vote at the board table. But if they're voting against it, that's fine. But if they're bringing something like to the floor that hasn't even gone before the Electoral Area Services Committee, that's where their board is now acting in contravention of their policy. And what we ran into last September was the Community Works Funds discussion for the Resource Recovery Center came before this committee, the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee said, no, we're not going to put the Community Works Funds towards the Resource Recovery Center. When it came before the board, an alternative motion was put center, and that caused a great deal of controversy. Now, on that point, I'd like to thank Director Lennox for actually kind of pointing this out to me, was the flexibility for the board to quote unquote borrow funds from another to quote unquote borrow funds from another EA's allocation. Now, if I was a politically savvy municipal director in a regional district, maybe somewhere else, or I could see a justification for saying, hey, we would like to borrow all of the, I could see a justification for saying, hey, we would like to borrow all of the community works funds to put towards the resource recovery center, and we'll cover it back at future intakes of community works funds. And then boom, there goes 1.2 or $1.4 million or however many years. We'll have to make sure that that money gets kind of topped back up for those electoral areas. That's something I want to avoid. And whether it's 25% towards regional or maybe 10%, I think we're kind of all splitting hairs, because there are going to be some things sometimes like, oh, Haywire Bay, let's put community works funds into Haywire Bay. Haywire Bay is in Area B, but I think we can all agree that it actually benefits the region more than just Area B. And when we did our board on the road, we didn't even tour Haywire Bay because it's more accessible through the road. We didn't even tour Haywire Bay because it's more accessible through the city. And I think it's the same thing with city. And I think it's the same thing with Shelter Point Park. Electoral Area Services Committee or Rural Services or whatever you call it. That's the history of, it was abolished because municipal directors, they weren't just not attending and not knowing about what was going on. As long as we're not scheduling it at the same time as a municipal council meeting, the municipal directors can absolutely attend. But I think that would then avoid the problem of acts as a stopgap, as a way of preventing those conflicts. And I've spoken with other electoral area directors at previous UBCM about the specific issue. And one of the things I heard from all of them was, you should change that policy back to the way it was. And that's what I'll keep advocating for. I think what we're doing is out of alignment with other regional districts. To answer Director McCormick's question, how other regional districts do it is how we used to do it before 2016. And now we're not doing it, and we're trying to figure out how to fix it. Thank you, Chair.
So we're straying. You're welcome, and we're straying way off. Like we remember our draw attention back to the fact of the motion on the table, and that's fine. We're hopefully wrapping up very soon. I think I'll be calling the question in a moment. But I saw the corporate officer had a comment, perhaps.
No, I'm okay. Thank you, Chair.
You're okay. So I think we've had a healthy discussion on this. Unless there's any burning questions, I believe I will be, or issues or more debate, I believe I will call the question on this item. So I'll call the question. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3. I'm in favor. 4. And all those opposed? 2 opposed. So who was in favor? Is 5 in favor. Okay, so Directors Lennox and Gisborne were opposed, I believe. Okay, and everyone else is in favor. Passes. Doesn't matter whether I voted or not. Okay, very good. We have dealt with that big item, and that brings us back to item 8.5, which is the Northside Volunteer Fire Services short-term borrowing resolution. And I'm looking. So first of all, is there any? I guess I'll open up for any comments or discussion, Director Brander.
Maybe we should postpone this one until we get that report back from staff about the first paragraph of 8.7.
Okay, so there's a motion to postpone. Is there a seconder for that? Director McCormick. Okay, discussion on moving to postpone this. And the only question I have for staff maybe is, sorry, go ahead, Director Brander. You want to speak?
I was just going to say, I think what we decide ultimately regarding the motion that we've sent back to staff will determine where the $150,000 towards electoral area A.
Thank you. And I'll just add, I see Director Lennox. I just wanted to ask Ms. Green, and is that from a timing point of view, is that okay if we postponed it?
Thank you, Chair. Through the Chair. It's okay as long as we have something in place before the end of the year. So we can't let it go past the end of the year.
Okay, so there's no time sensitivity. Director Lennox, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. That was my question, Chair. Was there any impact to the taxpayers immediately? And if not, you've answered my question by the end of the year.
Great. So there's no time issue. We can defer this. So is there any further discussion on this motion to postpone? Seeing none, I will Oh, Director Elliott?
Question. If you did move forward with this motion, and we came back with a different report with all kinds of numbers, you could then figure out how this allocation fits within that thing at a later date too, because it's a target, not a firm thing. I'm just curious about whether this is a significant number when it comes to trying to sort that out, and why you wouldn't just decide if it's a priority and move forward and adjust the targets as you would. And so that's also a possibility. I'm okay either way. I'm just.
Director Brander?
I guess my comment would just be that we heard from Manager of Financial Services that there is no time frame on this, so delaying it is probably not a big deal.
Okay, Director Gisborne.
I just can't keep it to myself. Actually spend community works funds and actually do something with community works funds, we're going to postpone it. I'm sorry, I just had to say I do find that entertaining. Thank you, Chair.
Well, it's a process. I'll just make a comment on that. I think there's a process to spend the money, and if we defer for a month, that is not an indication whatsoever of whether or not we don't support this. So, is there any further discussion on this item to postpone? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? Okay, I'll post. Okay, carried. I don't think anyone's opposed. Okay, fine. That's good. So we'll get this back in a month. Hopefully, we'll see if our agenda is big. That's the only other concern, is whether the agenda is going to be another whopper like this. Okay, so now we have no new business. Question period. Is there anyone in the room, or is the reporter?
I'm online, Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I don't have any questions this afternoon.
Thank you. You followed all that, and it was all very clear. I'm really glad to hear. Thank you for that. I should in camera.
these days in the summer now, right? But then you can go for Thai food, so that's the winning strategy. Just roll onto the ferry.
Yeah, I love it when you get on the ferry and like half the people sleeping. Thai food.
We're about to adjourn in a second here, everyone.
Hey guys,
Oh, sorry.
thank you, Chair. You just have to wait for the sound of the recording, but we are live.
Where did you probably go?